Hey, guys, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. If you walked into Ice Age Europe around 80,000 years ago, you'd probably freeze solid within 30 seconds. But before that happened, you might catch a glimpse of a Neanderthal, the local apex hominin, and possibly the only creature on Earth who looked like they could beat a mammoth in a wrestling match. Neanderthals weren't just different from modern humans. They were optimized for punishment. Imagine a person designed by a committee of bodybuilders, Arctic engineers, and someone who really liked forehead real estate. That's a Neanderthal. Let's start with the body. Neanderthals were shorter than us on average, around 5 to 4 to 5 to 6. But calling them short is misleading. They weren't small. They were condensed, stocky frames, huge rib cages, broad shoulders, and a build so sturdy it looked like their skeletons had been reinforced for demolition work. Their bones were thick, dense, and frankly overqualified for anything less than full-contact mammoth takedowns. Their limbs were short and powerful, which helped conserve heat in brutally cold climates. Their hands were massive, with strong thumbs, perfect for crafting tools, grabbing prey, or presumably opening pickle jars that modern humans wouldn't even attempt. And then there's the face. Neanderthals didn't look weird. We look weird. Their skulls were long and low, with prominent brow ridges that could have doubled as ski jumps. Their noses were large and forward-facing, possibly as a built-in heater for that frosty Ice Age air. Their jaws were powerful, their chins basically non-existent, and their expressions likely somewhere between mildly confused and always ready for a fight. But make no mistake, these weren't brutish thugs. This wasn't a failed prototype of humanity. This was a parallel success story. They were tailored top to bottom for their environment. And in that environment, they thrived. Neanderthals were the elite endurance athletes of their day. If that day involved ice storms, cave bears, and hunting dinner with a sharpened stick, every inch of them said, "Yes, I've broken several ribs. No, I don't regret it." If you've ever felt proud of your bone density after lifting a milk jug without hurting yourself, sit down. Neanderthals were walking fortresses. Their skeletons weren't just sturdy. They were sturdy medieval architecture. We're talking bones so thick they make modern human femurs look like discount chopsticks. Let's start with their legs. Neanderthal femurs were short and incredibly robust, designed not for running marathons, but for powering through rough mountainous terrain while carrying roughly half a reindeer on one shoulder. Their knees were shaped to handle constant bending and squatting, which is useful when you spend most of your day building fires, shaping stone tools, or elbow deep in large animal carcasses. Their arms are equally terrifying. Their upper arm bones were massively thick, and their forearms even thicker, a unique trait among hominids. This wasn't just for show. They weren't flexing on Instagram. They were literally built to wield heavy tools and haul enormous prey across rocky tundra. If modern humans are built like Swiss Army knives, Neanderthals were jackhammers with eyebrows. Even their rib cages told a story. Modern humans have more barrel-shaped rib cage, tapering toward the waist. Neanderthal, however, had wide, flaring rib cages that gave them room for huge lungs, likely necessary to survive the cold, oxygen-thin air of glacial Europe. Basically, their respiratory system was the equivalent of industrial bellows. More oxygen and more mammoth chasing energy out. And let's not forget the skull. Not just the brow ridges, although those were magnificent. Their skulls were longer, flatter, and thicker, with larger areas for muscle attachment. That meant powerful jaws and neck muscles. They could probably chew frozen venison without blinking. Interestingly, this reinforced skeleton came with a cost. They likely mature faster than us and may have had slightly shorter lifespans. But while they were around, they packed a lifetime of bruises, breaks, and brutal living into every year. Their bones show constant wear, healed fractures, joint damage, and blunt force trauma, like they were auditioning for a prehistoric action film. Let's address the big, brainy elephant in the room. Neanderthals had huge brains. Not metaphorically, literally. Their brains were bigger than ours, about 1,500 to 150 cubic centimeters, compared to our modern average of 150. That's right, the so-called brute cavemen were walking around with high-performance cranial engines, and they didn't even have spreadsheets to suffer through. But before you crown them honorary professors, a disclaimer. Bigger doesn't automatically mean smarter. A blue whale has a massive brain and has yet to invent indoor plumbing. That said, Neanderthals weren't just carrying around cranial ballast. They used it. A large portion of their brain volume went towards sensory processing and motor skills, especially vision and movement coordination. That makes sense when your daily schedule includes stalking elk in a snowstorm and not accidentally walking off a cliff. They needed to navigate dangerous terrain, track animals over long distances, and work with tools, all without the aid of Google Maps or opposable thumbs that scrolled Instagram. Their visual cortex was particularly large, likely giving them incredible eyesight. Picture sharp-eyed, frost-covered Neanderthals squinting dramatically into the blizzard like Ice Age anime characters, but with more fur and fewer monologues. And while their prefrontal cortex, let's think before we do this part, might have been proportionally smaller than ours. Evidence shows they weren't just acting on impulse. Their lives required planning, cooperation, and a surprising amount of creativity, including the kind that involves painting cave walls and possibly applying ochre-like early makeup. So yes, your ancient Neanderthal may have invented contouring long before TikTok did. Neanderthals also adapted impressively across Europe and parts of Asia, from dry steppe to icy tundra, which required some serious cognitive flexibility. They learned to use local resources, build shelter, make tools, and occasionally invent a new way to hurt themselves with flint. Still not impressed? Try this. We once thought all their tools and art were stolen ideas from early modern humans. Then we found Neanderthal art and ornaments older than anything Homo sapiens had done in the region. Turns out we were just late to the cave party. If nature had survived the worst conditions imaginable in a design contest, Neanderthals would have walked away with a prize and probably the trophy too, just to use it as a hammer. These hominins weren't just adapted to the Ice Age, they were engineered for it. Picture the kind of weather that makes your nose hairs freeze. And now imagine living in that without heated floors, hoodies, or any concept of hot cocoa. That's Neanderthal territory. Their bodies were short and stocky, not by accident, but by design. This compact shape helped them conserve body heat, which is exactly what you want when your environment looks like the freezer aisle of a cursed grocery store. Long, lanky limbs lose heat faster. Neanderthals had limbs so thick and short penguins would have nodded in approval. Their noses were massive, and no, not for sniffing out gossip. Their large nasal cavities helped warm and humidify frigid air before it reached their lungs. It was nature's version of an HVAC system built directly into their faces. A useful adaptation and a great excuse for having a face you could rest a brick on. Even their skin likely contributed to their icy resilience, while we can't know exact pigmentation. Most scientists agree they probably had lighter skin tones to better synthesize vitamin D in low-light conditions. Because if you're going to survive 6 months of perpetual gloom, you better be able to wring sunshine out of a gray sky. Their lungs were likely enormous, needed to fuel bodies that were doing manual labor 24/7, climbing, hunting, hauling, carving, and occasionally inventing new ways to pull a muscle. That wide-barreled chest wasn't for show. It was a prehistoric furnace. Clothing. Oh yes, they weren't running around in fur loincloths unless they were into that. Evidence suggests Neanderthals wore stitched hides to insulate themselves from the cold. And stitching isn't simple. It means they planned ahead, created tools, and probably had some version of winter wear and slightly less winter wear. In short, Neanderthals weren't barely surviving the Ice Age. They were thriving in it. They weren't nature's underdogs. They were nature's snow plows, designed to march through the cold, grunting softly and wondering why the mammoths were always so dramatic about it. When you think of Neanderthal fashion, you probably imagine a single fur draped over one shoulder, maybe held on by a piece of vine, accessorized with a club and a general lack of self-awareness. But real Neanderthal clothing, surprisingly sophisticated. Primitive, sure, but with more function than flair and just enough chaos to make a medieval tailor weave. Let's be clear, Ice Age Europe wasn't a great place to experiment with fashion minimalism. If you went outside in winter wearing just optimism and vibes, you'd freeze solid before you could say saber-toothed mistake. So Neanderthals got clever. Evidence suggests they didn't just wrap themselves in animal skins like discarded couch covers. They processed hides, softened them, and stitched them together using bone needles. That's right. They were hand-sewing outfits out of deer and mammoth before buttons were even a concept. And they didn't even complain on Reddit. And let's talk about accessories. Some Neanderthal sites contain eagle talons, pierced shells, and beads. These weren't strictly functional, which implies they liked a little flair. Maybe a dash of symbolism, maybe even some Ice Age swagger. Imagine a Neanderthal walking into camp like, yes, this claw necklace is real. Yes, I caught the bird myself. No, you may not touch it. They also used ochre, a naturally occurring red pigment, on their tools, bodies, and possibly even faces. Was it war paint? Decoration? Some kind of social signal? No one knows for sure, but it does mean at some point a Neanderthal looked at a red rock and said this would look incredible on my cheekbones. Now were they ready for Fashion Week? Not unless the runway was covered in snow, lit by firelight and followed by an intense hunt. But their clothing did what it needed to. It kept them warm, dry, and protected from both the weather and judgmental Homo sapiens. Let's also not overlook the practical brilliance. Every outfit was biodegradable, locally sourced, and cruelty-based because, well, hunting. That's sustainable Ice Age fashion. Neanderthals weren't just strong. They punched a woolly rhino in the face strongly, the kind of strength that makes you question whether physics was working differently back then, or if they were just born with a natural gym membership to the universe. Everything about their anatomy screams power. Their muscle mass was enormous, especially in the shoulders, arms, and legs. Areas needed for daily tasks like hurling spears, skinning animals, hauling carcasses, and occasionally moving boulders for fun. Their bone structure, as we've discussed, could support a small siege engine, which means those muscles weren't for show. They were functional gains. But how strong were they really? Estimates suggest a Neanderthal male could be up to 50% stronger than a modern human of the same size, and in terms of upper body strength, possibly even double. This isn't farm strong or dad strong. This accidentally rips the door off your cave strongly. They didn't just hunt from a distance with carefully thrown projectiles. No, Neanderthals preferred the close contact approach. They'd run up to large, angry Ice Age megafauna and jab them with spears at near point-blank range. Their version of dinner prep involved dodging tusks while keeping a firm grip on something that wanted them dead. And the wear and tear. Oh, it shows. Their fossil records are full of healed injuries. Broken arms, crushed ribs, damaged skulls. All signs that they weren't just strong, but resilient if a Neanderthal broke something. They either walked it off or wrapped it in moss and hoped for the best. Then they went right back to hunting. Even their grip strength was absurd. Some researchers believe they could crush modern humans' hands without trying. Their thumbs were larger, their fingers broader, and their knuckles capable of damage usually reserved for medieval weapons. If you're picturing The Rock, but fuzzier and more likely to throw a stone axe at you, you're not far off. If there's one thing Neanderthal fossils consistently tell us, it's that these people lived hard. Don't forget to wear sunscreen. More like tackle the raging bison before lunch hard. Their skeletons read less like quiet prehistoric memoirs and more like accident reports from an Ice Age rodeo. Seriously, when paleoanthropologists looked at the trauma patterns in Neanderthal remains, they noticed something oddly familiar. The types of injuries, fractured ribs, broken arms, crushed faces, were strikingly similar to those found in professional rodeo riders. And no, that is not a joke. Apparently, if you regularly tangle with one-ton mammals for a living, your bones tell a very specific kind of story. Take Shanidar 1, for example. This poor guy had a blow to the head that crushed part of his skull. Probably left him partially blind and also had a withered right arm, likely from a healed break. His foot was damaged too. Basically, he was the human equivalent of a walking before photo in an orthopedic ad, and yet he survived for years after those injuries. That means other Neanderthals were taking care of him, because apparently Even if you're a tank of a man with one working eye and a limp, your Ice Age buddies still make room for you at the fire. Another famous case, La Chapelle Ozin, an older male with severe arthritis, missing teeth and spinal issues. And again, he was clearly cared for. So not only were Neanderthals getting injured in ways that would terrify modern OSHA inspectors, but they were also helping each other heal emotional support and survival. Neanderthals said, yes, we do both, but the frequency of these injuries also tells us about their lifestyles. These were people who hunted small game from a distance or foraged daintily. They got up close and personal with danger. Their weapons were mostly thrusting spears. Think stab rather than throw. And when you hunt like that, the animal usually fights back. The next time you trip on a rug and feel sorry for yourself, remember Neanderthals spent their lives getting tackled by Ice Age death machines, shrugging it off with some moss and fire, and still lived long enough to invent personal grooming. Now that's resilience. Neanderthals didn't just survive the Ice Age. They brought fire to it, which is basically the prehistoric version of telling winter. Not today, Satan. Now, they weren't out there throwing fireballs or inventing Esmores, but they absolutely knew how to make, maintain, and weaponize fire in ways that would have made a caveman version of Bear Grylls nod approvingly. How do we know this? Archaeological sites reveal clear evidence of hearths, centralized fire pits with charred bones, heated stones, and layers of ash, sometimes built up over years in the same spot. That's not just a random wildfire. That's a Neanderthal choosing a nice location, building a fire, and then cooking dinner next to it while probably glaring at the wind. The prevailing theory is that they used methods like striking flint against pyrite, creating a spark that could ignite dry grass or moss. No matches, no lighters, no YouTube tutorials. Just raw determination and a suspicious pile of rocks. The Ice Age version of Hold My Beer. They didn't just use fire for warmth either. Fire helped them cook food, which made it easier to chew and digest. This wasn't just a culinary improvement. It also unlocked more nutrients, reduced parasites, and possibly gave them more time to invent other helpful things like gossip. Then there's the tool-making advantage. Heating flint can make it easier to nap or shape into tools, so it's possible Neanderthals were practicing thermal engineering before humans even figured out how to invent pointless committees. And let's not forget about defense. Fire scares predators. Sitting around a fire meant not only warmth and light, but a makeshift force field against anything that growled in the dark. Picture a bunch of Neanderthals roasting meat, telling stories, and casting intimidating shadows on the cave walls. Fire was their home security system. Were they the first to discover fire? Probably not. But they mastered it in their own steady, practical, and impressively chill way. They didn't flaunt it. They just quietly turned cold caves into livable homes and meat into slightly less chewy meat. Neanderthals didn't have multi-tools, screwdrivers, or YouTube how-tos, but give them a chunk of flint and a moment of silence, and they'd whip up a tool kit that could skin a deer, build a shelter, and possibly open a medieval wine bottle. Their tools weren't just sharp rocks. They were strategically crafted instruments made with attention to detail, purpose, and just the right amount of controlled violence. The primary technique they used, the Levallois method, a complicated multi-step process involving preparing a stone core in such a way that flakes could be removed in a predictable shape. In other words, they weren't just banging rocks together like toddlers. They were planning ahead, shaping cores, analyzing angles, and executing cuts with such finesse that modern archaeologists sometimes mistake their work for early Homo sapiens craftsmanship, which frankly must be annoying for them. Among the Neanderthal tool repertoire were scrapers, points, awls, borers, and even hafted tools, blades attached to wooden shafts using tree resin and sinew. That's not just making sharp things, that's prehistoric composite engineering, which is a fancy way of saying duct tape, but way harder to invent. They used these tools for everything. Butchering meat, tanning hides, woodworking, and probably the occasional angry gesture. And let's be real, anyone who can figure out how to glue stone to stick using trigu and patience deserves a TED Talk. Their toolkits varied by region too. This means Neanderthals weren't just copying one another. They were innovating, adapting their methods to local resources, climates, and prey. One group might use limestone, another flint. Some even seem to have experimented with bone and antler tools. It's like prehistoric Etsy, and they weren't afraid of improvement. Over time, their tools got more refined, more efficient, and arguably more deadly. This wasn't evolution doing the work. This was brains in practice. When most people picture Neanderthals, they imagine grunting figures hunched around a fire, club in one hand, dinner still twitching in the other. But the archaeological record tells, a different story, one where the same people who could dismember a reindeer in 5 minutes also paused to decorate a shell or bury a loved one with flowers. Yes, Neanderthals had culture, and not just the kind that grows on old meat. Let's start with burials. Multiple Neanderthal sites show evidence of intentional graves, often in shallow pits, sometimes with grave goods or traces of pollen, suggesting flowers may have been placed with the dead. Whether this was spiritual, symbolic, or just a prehistoric version of he-like plants, we may never know. But the point is, they cared. They mourned. They didn't just toss grandma behind a boulder and call it a day. And then there's art. For years, it was assumed Neanderthals didn't do art. That was supposed to be our thing. Then we found cave paintings in Spain, made with red ochre over 64,000 years ago. Spoiler, that's before modern humans showed up in Europe. That awkward silence you hear is anthropology professors reevaluating everything they once said with confidence. Neanderthals also collected decorative objects, pierced shells, feathers, eagle talons, things that served no obvious practical function unless they were secretly inventing cosplay. Some may have been used as ornaments, ritual objects, or social signals. Either way, they weren't just about surviving, they were about meaning. There's even a mysterious cave structure found in France, deep underground, made from broken stalagmites arranged into rings. No sunlight, no apparent use, no graffiti, just Neanderthals 176,000 years ago, building in the dark like they were summoning something, or maybe just being weird. Who knows? And we can't forget language. They had the hyoid bone, crucial for speech and genes related to language processing. So they may not have written poetry, but it's safe to say they weren't just grunting. Somewhere a Neanderthal once looked at another and said something meaningful, probably about meat, but still meaningful. Let's talk about what you're really curious about. Yes, Neanderthals and modern humans got together romantically. Biblically, DNA testably, when early Homo sapiens migrated into Europe and Asia around 60,000 years ago. They ran into the locals, the Neanderthals, and rather than treating them like distant cousins at a wedding, they did the evolutionary equivalent of asking you up with zero irony. We know this happened because it's written in our genes, literally. Most people of non-African descent today carry about 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA, which means somewhere in your ancestry, one of your very, very, very great-grandparents had an Ice Age date night that got out of hand. Was it love? Survival strategy? A prehistoric version of, well, the gene pool's not that big. Scientists are still debating. Some encounters were probably consensual, others less so. It's hard to say for certain what prehistoric romance looked like, but we do know it left genetic fingerprints that still linger in things like immune system traits, skin tone, and possibly your tendency to dislike cilantro. Also interesting, this wasn't just a one-time fluke. Genetic evidence shows that interbreeding happened multiple times in different places over thousands of years, so clearly. It wasn't just one confused Homo sapiens at a very dark cave party, and it wasn't all in one direction. Neanderthal males and Homo sapiens females seem to mix more frequently, possibly due to the sheer charisma of early human travel stories and slightly better cheekbones. Though we'll never know if the Neanderthals were more impressed by conversation skills or fire-starting ability. What we do know is that this mixing didn't result in a blended superspecies. The Neanderthals eventually disappeared, but parts of them live on in us. Your slightly wide nose? That could be a Neanderthal gift. Your love of red meat and aversion to cardio? Also suspicious. Before you laugh at Neanderthals for their giant brows or suspicious fashion choices, you should probably check your ancestry report, because statistically speaking, you might be part Neanderthal. No offense, it's science, thanks to genome sequencing. And the tireless efforts of geneticists with high-powered microscopes and too much coffee. We now know that most people of non-African descent carry about 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA. That means if you're watching this and your great grandparent wore fur and didn't blink during snowstorms, congratulations, you're a little bit Ice Age. And this ancient inheritance isn't just a quirky footnote. It shows up in real ways. For starters, Neanderthal genes have been linked to traits involving skin tone, hair texture, immune response, and even pain sensitivity. So if you sunburn easily, react strangely to allergens, or stub a toe and feel like you've been shot, you may have the Neanderthal edition of human firmware. There's even evidence that Neanderthal DNA affects how people sleep, process fat, and respond to certain medications. Some studies suggest it may influence mood regulation, meaning yes, your brooding tendencies and general grumpiness in winter may be genetically justified, but it's not all good news. Some Neanderthal gene variants have also been linked to conditions like type 2 diabetes, depression, and nicotine addiction. So while your ancient cousins might have helped you survive a woolly mammoth ambush, they might also be partly responsible for your impulse to buy snacks and doom scroll at 2 a.m. It's also worth noting that African populations whose ancestors didn't interbreed with Neanderthals after migrating out of Africa have little to no Neanderthal DNA. But they do have traces of other archaic humans, like the Denisovans, meaning the human family tree is less of a clean chart and more of a tangled, romantically chaotic shrub. Neanderthals thrived for nearly 300,000 years, surviving ice ages, saber-toothed predators, and each other. They were the original Europeans, the true locals. And then, roughly 40,000 years ago, they vanished quietly. No dramatic extinction event, no comet, just fade to black, like they missed the memo about sticking around for the Holocene. So what happened? One theory is climate change as the last ice age began shifting. Neanderthals struggled to adapt to new environments. Their hunting grounds changed, large game became scarce, and even mammoths started acting dramatic. For a group built to dominate the cold, warming weather was less summer vibes and more existential crisis. Another theory, competition with Homo sapiens. When modern humans arrived in Europe, they brought things like long-distance weapons, more varied diets, and that extremely annoying habit of surviving everywhere. They reproduced faster, travel farther, and possibly talk more, which in a species contest counts for a lot. It's also likely that Neanderthals were outnumbered. Their populations were smaller and more isolated, meaning less genetic diversity. A serious problem when every winter is a survival game show, and your neighbors are reproducing like it's a competitive sport. And yet this wasn't a violent takeover. There's no massive evidence of genocide or battles. If anything, Neanderthals and humans coexisted for thousands of years, traded DNA, shared ideas, and probably some awkward campfire conversations, and slowly blended until there weren't any pure Neanderthal populations left. The last known Neanderthals likely lived in southern Iberia, places like Gibraltar, where they held on for a few thousand years more like the final flickers of a candle. The archaeological record goes quiet. No new tools, no new burials, just stillness. But this wasn't a failure. It was a chapter, and one that left a permanent mark. Neanderthals didn't go out with a bang, but their influence lives on. Not in monuments or scrolls, but in DNA, in bones and blood. They weren't erased. They were absorbed for most of modern history. Neanderthals got the short end of the evolutionary stick, not in terms of biology, but in public relations. They were the original victims of bad press. When the first Neanderthal fossils were discovered in the mid-1800s, scientists weren't sure what to make of them. The skull looked humanish, but the brow ridges were huge and the limbs were weirdly thick, like someone had taken a normal person and run them through a bulk filter. Victorian scientists, being Victorian scientists, quickly labeled them brutish, primitive, and likely terrible at dinner conversation. Thus began the myth of the stooped, grunting caveman, part monster, part embarrassing uncle. And the name Neanderthal itself didn't help. It sounded harsh, like something that might live under a bridge and throw stones at goats. Early reconstructions didn't do them any favors either. One famous depiction showed a Neanderthal standing like a gorilla with 1,000-yard stare and no neck, which spoiler was based on an elderly individual with arthritis. That would be like judging all humans based on someone's great-grandpa during a back spasm. The image stuck. Cartoons, movies, and textbooks reinforced the stereotype. A dumb brute with a club and questionable posture. Meanwhile, the truth that Neanderthals buried their dead, created art, made tools, and possibly wore jewelry was quietly ignored in favor of grunts and loincloths. Why did we do this? Probably because it made us feel superior. Humans love a good story about how we were the chosen ones, the smart ones, the only ones, reducing Neanderthals to failed prototypes. Let us keep that narrative intact. It also helped explain away any uncomfortable genetic overlap. Sure, we're related, but we're better, right? Only recently has the myth begun to unravel. As more archaeological discoveries emerge, we're forced to admit that Neanderthals were more like us than not. They weren't mistakes. They were a parallel success. Different strategies, same struggle. In the war-torn twilight of Japan's Heian period, the battlefield was no place for a woman. And yet that's precisely where Tomo Gozen belonged. Imagine a sea of armored men clashing steel in the dust and chaos of war, and among them, one lone figure stands out. Not because she was out of place, but because she was more skilled, more fearless, and more precise than most of the warriors around her. Tomo Gozen wasn't just some camp follower or noble lady playing at war. She was a trained warrior on a musha from the province of Ekigo. From a young age, she was taught to ride, to shoot a bow from horseback, and to wield the katana with such ferocity that she left men twice her size bleeding in the dirt. Her loyalty lay with Minamoto no Yashinaka, a prominent general of the Minamoto clan. But make no mistake, Tomo wasn't merely his bodyguard or ornament. She was his commander, his equal, his enforcer. Contemporary accounts describe her as a remarkably beautiful woman with white skin, long hair, and charming features. But the compliments didn't stop at her looks. They spoke of her strength, her uncanny skill in archery, and her unmatched swordsmanship. And this wasn't poetry or court gossip. It was a battlefield fact. She could break through ranks, decapitate a foe mid-gallop, and keep riding without so much as a misstep. Tomo Gozen was a storm in human form, and the timing of her rise was no coincidence. Japan was being torn apart in the Genpei War, a civil conflict between the Minamoto and Terra clans for control of the imperial throne. Feudal codes were being rewritten, the samurai class was rising, and in this vacuum of order and chaos, Tomo Gozen carved out a space no woman had ever dared claim before on the front lines. She didn't just fight. She commanded troops. She won duels. She carried heads back to camp like any warrior proving their kill. And most of all, she defied the carefully drawn lines of what womanhood was supposed to look like in 12th century Japan. Tomo Gozen wasn't an exception. She was a revelation, a warning, and a legend in the making. Before Tomo Gozen ever tasted battle, she had to master survival in a world built to exclude her. Feudal Japan was steeped in hierarchy, honor, and hard lines, especially for women. Daughters of samurai were expected to be polite, loyal, and quiet. But Tomo's early life was anything but conventional. We don't know her exact birth date, but she was likely born into a minor samurai family during the late Heian period. Some accounts suggest she may have been raised in the household of Minamoto no Yashinaka himself. Whether she was his concubine, foster sister, or trusted retainer remains debated. But what's not debated is her skill. That didn't appear by accident. That was earned while young boys were handed swords and drilled in the Bushido code. Tomo would have had to prove again and again that she could do everything they could and better. Her training would have been brutal. Swordsmanship wasn't just about strength, it was about timing, control, and reading your opponent. She would have trained in Kenjutsu for blade work and Kudo for archery, all while learning to fight in heavy armor and manage a warhorse in full gallop. In the rare moments of peace, she likely learned the Naginata, a curved blade polearm traditionally associated with female warriors. But make no mistake, this wasn't some symbolic ceremonial practice. This was preparation for real violence. Tomo's fighting style combined elegance and lethality, and she didn't just keep up with the men, she often surpassed them. This phase of her life, before the battles, before the legends, was marked by isolation. Most women didn't carry swords. Most women didn't speak in strategy meetings, and most women weren't expected to live long on the battlefield. But Tomo forced the world to bend around her. Every skill she learned had to be twice as sharp, twice as precise, and twice as deadly as her male counterparts. Because if she failed, no one would call it a soldier's mistake. They'd call it a woman's weakness. And so, before Tomo Guzan could ever carve her name into the history books, she first had to carve her place into the samurai world, blade by blade, day by day, in silence and shadow, not by invitation, but by sheer will. By the time Tomo Gozan reached adulthood, Japan was on the brink of collapse. The Jinpei War, a bitter civil conflict between the Taira and Minamoto clans, erupted in 1180. It wasn't just a clash of armies, it was a complete reshaping of the country's power structure. Emperors were being manipulated like chess pieces, and the warrior class was about to seize control of history. And Tomo, she was right in the thick of it. Her lord and possible lover, Minamoto no Yashinaka, was a distant cousin to the more famous Minamoto no Yoritomo. But unlike Yoritomo, Yashinaka wasn't content with standing in the shadows. He wanted control over Kyoto, over the Minamoto clan, over the entire country. And when war broke out, he didn't hesitate. He raised his own army in the northern provinces and began his campaign southward, right beside him, Tomo Gozan. She wasn't just a token warrior to show off in court. Tomo led troops into battle. She made strategic decisions, and when the fighting got bloody, she was at the front lines, blade drawn, giving orders most men wouldn't dare to question. She was a symbol of Yashinaka's audacity, his willingness to defy tradition and win by any means necessary. The Jinpei War was a savage affair. Battles were fought on rivers, in forests, through mountains. Arrows rained like monsoon storms, and hand-to-hand combat left the earth soaked in blood. One of Tomo's most famous victories came during the Battle of Yokota-Iwara, where she reportedly led a charge that decimated enemy forces. Chronicles claim she personally took the heads of several samurai and presented them as trophies. It wasn't for vanity, it was for proof. Every kill was a receipt, every head a message. But war wasn't just about glory, it was about loyalty and betrayal. As Yashinaka gained power, tensions rose with Yoritomo, who saw his cousin's ambition as a threat. The Minamoto clan, already splintered by pride and ego, began to turn inward. While the Taira remained the enemy on paper, Yashinaka now had to watch his back. Tomo, ever loyal, stayed close. But even the strongest sword couldn't cut through politics. And as the war intensified, so did the pressure, not just on Yashinaka's claim to power, but on Tomo's place in history as the Jinpei War dragged on. Yashinaka's ambition outpaced his alliances. In 1183, after a series of brilliant military victories, he achieved what many thought impossible. He drove the Taira out of Kyoto and took control of the imperial court. At that moment, he was the most powerful man in Japan, and standing beside him, as always, was Tomo Gozan, victorious, loyal, and bloodstained. But power is a double-edged blade. Yashinika had dreamed of restoring imperial authority, but the emperor and court nobles quickly realized he was as uncontrollable as the war he fought. He plundered the city, antagonized Kyoto's elite, and began making moves that alarmed even his fellow Minamoto. Most damning of all, he tried to take control of Emperor Go Shirakawa, a symbolic act of supreme authority that would doom him politically. Minamoto no Yoritomo, now the de facto leader of the Minamoto faction, responded with swift condemnation. He declared Yashinaka a traitor and dispatched two loyal generals, Minamoto no Noriyuri and the famed Minamoto no Yoshitsune, to eliminate him. The Minamoto Civil War had begun, and Tomo Gozan was now fighting not against the Taira, but against her own clan. What followed was a rapid, tragic descent of Yashinaka. Once the bold and reckless upstart found himself outmaneuvered and outnumbered, he retreated from Kyoto with only a handful of loyal retainers, including Tomo. They made their final stand at the Battle of Owazu in early 1184. It would be a last gasp, not for glory, but for honor. As the enemy closed in, Tomo fought like a demon unleashed. Chronicles say she charged into the enemy lines, found the strongest warrior she could, and promptly decapitated him before riding back through the carnage. It wasn't just skill, it was a message. Even in defeat, she wouldn't be erased. But Yashinaka knew it was over. Legend holds that he asked Tomo to leave the battlefield, not because he doubted her bravery, but because dying alongside a woman would be considered shameful for a samurai general. It was a cruel irony. The fiercest warrior at his side was being dismissed to protect his legacy. Did she obey? Some sources say yes. Others suggest she vanished into battle and was never seen again. Either way, the fall of Yashinaka was the end of an era and the beginning of a myth. Snow blanketed the battlefield. It was February of 1184, and the plains of Wazu were quiet, too quiet for the bloody storm about to come. Minamoto no Yashinaka stood with only a few dozen men left, once a conqueror of Kyoto, now a fugitive of his own clan. His final stand had come, and Tomo Guzan, ever at his side, was not about to let him die alone. The odds were hopeless. Hundreds of enemy warriors, led by Yoshitsune and Noriyori, bore down on them. Their armor gleamed, their horses kicked up frozen earth. And amidst the frigid winds, Tomo Guzan had just. Her helmet, drew her sword, and charged into legend. According to the 14th century Heike Monogatari, Tomo did not retreat. She surged forward like a whirlwind, seeking the strongest opponent she could find, Hikamashigatara, a famed warrior in his own right. Whether out of fury, desperation, or a refusal to die quietly, Tomo didn't wait for introductions. She locked blades, unseated him, and cut off his head in one fluid motion, one final trophy. This wasn't just showmanship. It was a samurai ethos in motion to die beautifully, to fight to the last breath, to prove oneself in the face of impossible odds. For Tomo, it was also the moment that would define her for centuries. This singular act, recounted and reimagined by countless generations, became her battle cry, echoing across time. Meanwhile, Yashinaka's horse became stuck in a rice paddy, and a volley of arrows brought him down. His loyal companion, Imai Kanehira, committed suicide in dramatic fashion, placing his sword in his mouth and leaping from his horse. The warlord's inner circle had been extinguished. But Tomo, here the records diverge. One version claims Yashinaka ordered her to flee before his death, fearing the shame of dying alongside a woman. Others say she refused, fought her way out, and vanished into the mountains. Still, others say she was captured, forced to marry an enemy general, and later became a nun. None of these endings have been confirmed. But one thing is certain. Her last recorded act at Wazu was not one of surrender. It was one of defiance. Tomo Guzan didn't just disappear. She ascended into legend, carried on the back of one perfect, furious final charge. After the blood-soaked snows of Awazu, Tomo Guzan vanished from the official records as if she rode straight off the battlefield and into myth. No historian can say with certainty what happened to her, and perhaps that's fitting. Warriors like Tomo weren't supposed to survive. They were supposed to die with their lord, their sword, and their honor. But Tomo? She may have chosen something far more rebellious to live. The Heike Monogatari, our main source on Tomo's life, offers conflicting stories. One claims she was captured and forced to marry one of Yoritomo's generals, Wada Yashimori. She bore him a child, and after his death she became a nun, retreating from the world of steel and politics. Another tale claims she cut off her long warrior's hair, assumed a new identity, and vanished into the mountain monasteries of Nagano, never to be seen again. Yet another version hints that she continued to wander the countryside as a ronin, an unaligned warrior hired for private vengeance and borderland skirmishes, and then silent centuries of it. The truth, buried somewhere under folklore, scrolls, and oral tales, may never surface. But Tomo's vanishing act became part of her power. By slipping out of history, she became immortal. She was no longer constrained by one ending, one role, or one version of femininity. Instead, she became a symbol of possibility. What makes her story even more enigmatic is how Japan itself evolved in her absence. The rise of the shogunate under Minamoto no Yoritomo marked the beginning of the Kamakura period, a rigid, patriarchal era where women were pushed further into the background. Female warriors didn't vanish completely, but they were increasingly sidelined, romanticized, or erased. And yet Tomo endured, not in the dusty scrolls of official history, perhaps, but in the stories mothers told their daughters and soldiers whispered around campfires. She became a ghost that haunted the samurai ideal, the woman who fought like 10 men but answered no one over time. Playwrights and artists resurrected her, sometimes as a tragic lover, sometimes as an avenging demon, sometimes as the last true samurai, but always as a figure who defied expectations and left a trail of mystery behind her. Tomo Gozen didn't just vanish, she transformed, and the silence she left behind roars louder than any death scene. As centuries passed, the woman once feared on the battlefield became something else entirely, a legend molded by poets, monks, and playwrights. In an era where women were expected to be invisible, Tomo Gozen became unforgettable. The Heike Monogatari, a sweeping semi-historical war epic compiled in the 13th century, was the first to etch her into cultural memory. But this text was never just a history book. It was a performance. It was a theater blind monks known as Biwa-hoshi traveled from town to town, chanting the stories of the Jinpei War to the sound of the biwa lute. Through their voices, Tomo Gozen was reborn, not just as a fighter, but as a tragic heroine. Later adaptations embellished her even further. In No and Kabuki theater, Tomo became a recurring figure, her beauty exaggerated, her loyalty dramatized, her battles stylized to perfection. She was often paired with doomed love stories, tearful farewells, and moral lessons about honor and duty. The audiences didn't just watch her fight. They wept for her, admired her, and feared her in equal measure. But this romanticization came at a cost. The real woman, the one who decapitated enemies and led cavalry charges, was gradually softened. Over time, her armor was traded for flowing kimonos. Her swordplay became metaphors for feminine resilience. She became palatable, noble, tamed, and yet her image refused to die. Artists throughout the Edo period painted her riding into battle, face calm, blade poised. Samurai guides included her in lists of martial paragons. Sword schools invoked her name. Even as her story was mythologized, it still carried the sharp edge of the battlefield. In modern Japan, Tomo Gozen is often mentioned in the same breath as other legendary warriors, Musashi, Benkei, Yoshitsune. But unlike them, she carries the unique weight of gender defiance. She wasn't just an exception to the rule, she was a challenge to it. In every era since, women have looked to Tomo as proof that their place is wherever they choose to stand, even if that's the heart of the battlefield. The further she drifted from fact, the closer she became to symbols. A woman who shouldn't have existed, yet did. A warrior who couldn't be contained, yet endured, and a story that refused to end. Tomo Gozen's blade may have been sheathed over 800 years ago, but her presence lingers, etched not only in legend, but the cultural psyche of Japan and beyond as generations passed. She became more than just a figure from the Jinpei War. She became a symbol of resistance, individuality, and the disruptive power of a woman who refuses to follow the script. During the Edo period, when samurai culture was formalized and ritualized into a strict code of conduct, Tomo's image was used both as inspiration and caution. Some saw her as an embodiment of ideal loyalty, a warrior who served her lord to the bitter end. Especially in patriarchal scholarly circles, saw her as a dangerous anomaly, proof that when women step beyond their prescribed role, chaos follows. But even those who feared her couldn't erase her. By the Meiji Restoration in the late 19th century, when Japan sought to modernize and define its national identity, Tomo re-emerged in textbooks and public discourse, this time as a patriotic heroine. She appeared in children's books, school plays, and nationalistic art, often alongside male samurai legends. While the portrayal was sanitized, the fact remained that a female warrior had made it into the canon. In the 20th and 21st centuries, Tomo's legacy evolved once again. She became a favorite subject for manga artists, video game developers, feminist scholars, and filmmakers. In a media landscape full of cookie-cutter characters, Tomo stood apart. A woman whose legend wasn't based on romance, but on combat. She wasn't the lover left behind. She was the one who picked up the sword and fought forward. Modern portrayals of Tomo reflect shifting attitudes. Some cast her as a feminist icon, others as a tragic figure of unfulfilled destiny. Some present her as a warrior spirit haunting the battlefields. No matter the interpretation, she is always strong, always complex. and always just beyond the reach of complete understanding. Even in politics and education, Tomo Gozen has become shorthand for defiance. Schools are named after her. Martial arts dojos cite her in their lineage. She appears on stamps, posters, and even anime storylines, her name invoked whenever someone needs to prove that a warrior's soul can come in any form. She may have fought a war, but her presence continues to rally people across every battle for identity, justice, and place. Tomo Gozen never asked to be remembered. She didn't leave behind memoirs, letters, or poetic reflections. She left behind the only thing that truly mattered to a warrior of her age, a legacy forged in blood, loyalty, and fire. And in doing so, she achieved something few in history ever managed: immortality without asking for it. Unlike many women of her time, Tomo wasn't preserved because she fit society's ideals. She was preserved because she broke them. Every time she swung her blade on a battlefield, swarming with men who thought her unworthy, she rewrote the rules of feudal Japan. And though she vanished into obscurity, her absence only made her story louder in a culture where silence often defined a woman's worth. Tomo's silence after Owazu has become its own kind of roar. The absence of concrete facts surrounding her fate has given generations of artists, scholars, and revolutionaries permission to fill the void with meaning. She has become the embodiment of possibility, proof that one can defy the structure and still become legend. Her name lives on not just in literature and pop culture, but in the spirit of every woman who refuses to be invisible, every athlete who pushes beyond her limits, every leader who's told she's too bold, every fighter who doesn't wait for permission to stand her ground. Tomo Gozen isn't just a historical figure. She's a standard-bearer of defiance wrapped in silence. Today, statues of her stand in Nagano and across Japan. Schoolgirls study her in history classes. Cosplayers dress as her at anime conventions. Martial artists whisper her name as they train with the Naginata. She even appears in international games and series, reminding global audiences that the archetype of the female warrior isn't fiction, it's history. And yet her greatest power may lie in the fact that we still don't fully know her. Was she a concubine turned general? A foster daughter raised in the art of war? A lone Ronin who walked into the mountains and never looked back? We may never uncover the full truth, but maybe that's the point. Tomo Gozen was never meant to be one story. She was meant to be many, not bound by records, nor erased by time, just eternally riding, sword drawn into the legend she forged herself. Before satellites lit up the sky and compasses pointed in, ancient mariners stared out over endless horizons and asked the boldest question of all: what's out there? These weren't reckless fools. They were engineers, navigators, and dreamers. And with little more than the stars overhead and the winds in their sails, they carved sea routes that would become the first arteries of global connection. Humanity's relationship with the sea began tens of thousands of years ago. Some of the earliest evidence of watercraft dates back over 40,000 years, long before the agricultural revolution. Even then, early humans were already using rafts to reach distant islands like Australia, which required crossing hundreds of miles of open ocean. These are not lucky accidents. They were planned journeys made with a clear understanding of tides, winds, and celestial patterns. By 3000 BCE, maritime technology was flourishing. Cultures in Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, and along the Nile were already using boats for trade and fishing. But it wasn't until certain cultures took to the high seas that true oceanic navigation began. These early seafarers faced enormous challenges. No maps, no written instructions, and often no guarantee they'd ever return. And yet they went, driven by necessity, curiosity, and survival. They read the waves like a book. They observed how clouds formed over islands, how birds flew at certain times of day, and how the stars rotated across the sky. The night sky in particular became their greatest tool. Polaris in the northern hemisphere, for instance, served as a fixed point for orientation. In the southern hemisphere, navigators watched the Southern Cross. These seafarers learned to feel the subtle push of currents beneath their hulls. They learned the sound of the wind in their sails, and most impressively, they passed this knowledge down orally for generations. Through chants, stories, and sacred traditions, their tools weren't compasses or astrolabes. Their tools were memory, observation, and intuition. This wasn't just survival. It was science before science had a name, a way of knowing the world that married nature and culture. And as they set out across unknown waters, these ancient mariners weren't just navigating oceans, they were laying the foundations for global trade, migration, and the first connections between civilizations that had never even heard each other's names. Long before the rise of Athens or the glory of Rome, the island of Crete was home to one of the most sophisticated seafaring civilizations the ancient world had ever seen, the Minoans. Flourishing from around 2000 to 1450 BCE, the Minoans weren't just islanders. They were maritime architects who turned the sea into a superhighway of culture, commerce, and control. At the heart of Minoan power was the city of Knossos, a sprawling palace complex adorned with vibrant frescoes of dolphins, ships, and sea life. These weren't decorative flourishes, they were declarations. The Minoans lived and breathed the sea. Their economy thrived on maritime trade, and their influence stretched across the Aegean, reaching Egypt, the Levant, and beyond. Unlike later Greek navies built for war, Minoan ships were designed for speed and stability, ideal for trade and diplomatic missions. Their vessels, often decorated with bird or bull motifs, used square sails and rowers to navigate the calm yet unpredictable Mediterranean. These ships carried everything from olive oil and wine to pottery and bronze. But more than goods, the Minoans carried ideas, art, religion, and technologies, dispersing them like waves across the Aegean. And how did they navigate? While there are no surviving Minoan navigational charts, archaeologists believe they relied on a combination of star-based navigation and visual markers, coastal headlands, the color of the water, bird flight paths. Their consistent returns from long journeys suggest a deep understanding of seasonal winds and maritime rhythms, long before anyone wrote them down. One of the most remarkable signs of Minoan maritime prowess is their role in the development of the Greek alphabet. By interacting with Near Eastern cultures like the Phoenicians, the Minoans helped pave the way for what history's most influential scripts. Their ships weren't just ferrying cargo, they were floating vessels of cultural exchange. But like many sea-based powers, their end may have come from the very ocean they mastered around 1450 BCE. A volcanic eruption on the nearby island of Thera, modern-day Santorini, may have triggered tsunamis and ash clouds that devastated Minoan ports and destabilized their control. Whether by nature or invasion, their ships eventually disappeared from the waves. Still, the Minoans left behind more than ruins. They left behind a legacy of what it meant to rule not by land, but by sea. If the Minoans were the artists of the sea, then the Phoenicians were its tireless entrepreneurs. From around 1500 BCE to 300 BCE, the Phoenicians, a loose confederation of city-states like Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos, dominated the eastern Mediterranean, not with armies, but with fleets. Their legacy isn't one of empires and conquests. It's one of navigation, trade, and the spread of culture across the known world. The Phoenicians didn't have a unified kingdom or grand capital. What they had were ships, and lots of them. These were sleek, fast, and highly maneuverable vessels capable of long-distance trade. Using both square sails and banks of oars, their ships could hug coastlines or dart across open water, and with them they brought glass, cedar wood, purple dye, and most importantly, ideas. They were the middlemen of the ancient world, linking Egypt with Anatolia, Greece with Mesopotamia, and North Africa with the western Mediterranean. They established outposts and colonies across the coastlines, most famously Carthage in North Africa, which would later rise to rival Rome. Each colony acted like a node in a vast maritime network, with the mother cities back east reaping the benefits of trans-Mediterranean commerce. But how did they manage to sail such distances with no compass or sextant like their Minoan predecessors? The Phoenicians used the stars, particularly Polaris, the North Star, as their guide. They also understood prevailing wind patterns, coastal features, and current behavior. Many scholars credit them with developing one of the first systems of celestial navigation in the Western world. Yet their greatest contribution wasn't something they carried. It was something they invented, the alphabet, the Phoenician writing system. Developed around 1050 BCE was a revolutionary leap, an alphabet of just 22 characters representing sounds rather than entire words or syllables. This script would go on to inspire the Greek, Latin, Hebrew, and Arabic alphabets. Through this linguistic breakthrough and their seafaring tenacity, the Phoenicians didn't just trade, they connected. They turned the sea from a barrier into a bridge linking cultures, languages, and economies. And they did so not by colonizing hearts and minds, but by sailing from one to the next. The Mediterranean wasn't just their highway, it was their identity. While the Mediterranean world was abuzz with Phoenician traders and Greek triremes, an entirely different maritime saga was unfolding on the opposite side of the planet, one of outriggers, double-hull canoes and stars charting across the largest ocean on Earth. These were the Austronesian seafarers, and they didn't just sail the seas. They colonized half the planet's surface without metal tools, maps, or written language. Originating from what is now Taiwan around 3000 BCE, the Austronesians expanded steadily southward and eastward, hopping from island to island with astonishing speed. By 1500 BCE, they had reached the Philippines, Indonesia, and the edges of New Guinea. By 1000 BCE, they were in Micronesia and Melanesia, and by the 1st century CE, they had reached as far as Madagascar to the west and Easter Island to the east, an arc of human migration that spans over 10,000 miles. Their vessels were marvels of engineering. Austronesians developed outrigger canoes for stability, and later double-hulled voyaging canoes capable of carrying families, livestock, and cargo across thousands of miles of open ocean. They harnessed wind through crab claw sails and used paddles for precision near islands, but what truly set them apart was their paralleled skill in navigation. They used the sun, moon, planets, and more than 200 stars as guides. But that's just the beginning. Austronesian navigators, especially the famed Polynesian wayfinders, read the ocean like a living map. They could detect subtle changes in wave patterns caused by distant islands reflecting swells. They followed seabird flight paths, studied cloud formations, and even tasted sea water for salinity shifts near land. This wasn't instinct. It was highly refined science, passed down orally through chance and memory devices. Their migration wasn't random exploration. It was intentional and repeatable. Lapita pottery, a distinctive cultural artifact, marks their path across the Pacific, showing how interconnected their world truly was. They weren't just island hoppers. They were civilization builders, spreading agriculture, languages, and technology wherever they landed. And in many ways, they still are. Modern genetic studies, linguistics, and archaeology continue to uncover just how advanced and expansive Austronesian navigation was. These mariners didn't just cross oceans, they connected some of the most remote corners of the Earth long before European explorers ever left port in the Pacific. The sea was never a void, it was a roadmap. When we think of ancient Egypt, towering pyramids and desert tombs usually come to mind, not ships. But the Egyptians were no strangers to water. The Nile was their lifeline, their highway, and their first school of navigation. Yet what's often overlooked is how the Egyptians extended their maritime reach far beyond the riverbanks, venturing into the Red Sea and possibly even further afield. Egypt's mastery of the Nile began early. As far back as 3000 BCE, they built large wooden boats with planks lashed together by rope and sealed with resin. These vessels, propelled by both sails and oars, were essential for transporting goods, soldiers, and grain across the vast stretches of the river. But the Nile was only the beginning by the time of Pharaoh Hatshepsut in the 15th century BCE. Egypt was launching sea expeditions from ports along the Red Sea. Her famous voyage to the mysterious land of Punt, possibly located in modern-day Somalia, Eritrea, or southern Arabia, was a landmark in ancient maritime history. Reliefs from her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari show detailed depictions of large cargo ships loaded with exotic animals, incense trees, and gold, all returning from a successful voyage across the sea. These weren't accidental drifts. They were carefully organized missions planned with knowledge of monsoon wind patterns, currents, and seasonal timing. Egyptian sailors would have hugged coastlines, used star patterns for navigation, and relied on maritime scouts, perhaps even recruiting skilled local sailors from the Red Sea region. Some theories even suggest Egyptian contact with the Indus Valley via indirect maritime trade, especially during the peak of Mesopotamian Indus-Egyptian interaction. While direct evidence is limited, items such as ivory, lapis lazuli, and spices hint at a broader Indian Ocean trade network in which Egypt may have played a part. The ships themselves were engineering marvels for their time. Built from imported cedar wood, mostly from Lebanon, Egyptian seafaring vessels featured curved hulls and large square sails. These ships could carry heavy loads. and withstand the swells of the Red Sea. Though the Egyptians never became a dominant naval power like the Phoenicians, they left an important legacy. They were among the first to treat maritime voyages as royal, sacred, and strategic endeavors. Their sea journeys were extensions of their empire, diplomacy, and divine authority. On land, they built pyramids, but on water, they launched ambition. Amid the dusty plains of modern-day Pakistan and northwest India, once thrived one of the world's oldest urban civilizations, the Harappans, or the Indus Valley Civilization. Flourishing between 2600 and 1900 BCE, they built cities with advanced sanitation, standardized bricks, and remarkable urban planning. But buried beneath this archaeological brilliance is another truth, one less spoken but deeply significant. The Harappans were maritime traders. Unlike Egypt or Mesopotamia, the Harappans left behind no deciphered writing, no grand naval reliefs, and no epic tales of sea voyages. Yet clues of their maritime prowess quietly, the archaeological record. Excavations at Lodhal, a major Harappan port city in Gujarat, reveal what many believe is one of the world's earliest known dockyards. Measuring 218 meters long with floodgates and channels, it connected to an ancient river that flowed to the Arabian Sea, proof that Harappan engineers weren't just thinking inland, but outward. Artifacts tell the rest of the story. Harappan seals and goods, beads, ivory, ceramics have been found in Mesopotamia, specifically in the Sumerian cities of Ur and Lagash. Akkadian texts refer to a distant land called Meluha, likely the Indus region from which boats arrived bearing exotic goods. In return, the Harappans received silver, tin, and lapis lazuli, suggesting a complex trade network stretching from the Persian Gulf to the broader Near East. But how did they sail? While no complete Harappan ships survive, miniature models, terracotta boats, and carved depictions suggest the use of flat-bottomed rivercraft and seagoing vessels. They likely used the same seasonal monsoon winds that would later DR Arabian and Indian traders across the Indian Ocean. Harappan mariners probably hugged coastlines, stopping at natural harbors and estuaries, and navigated using celestial cues and current patterns. Unlike the warrior-focused empires of their time, the Harappans were remarkably peaceful. Their cities show little evidence of warfare or fortifications. This makes their maritime connections even more intriguing. They weren't conquering foreign shores. They were connecting them through trade and diplomacy. And then, around 1900 BCE, civilization began to decline. Rivers shifted, trade dwindled, and cities were abandoned. Their script faded with them, leaving behind a silent question. Just how far did their ships sail? Though their voices are lost, the water trails remain, etched in harbors' seals and silent stones. For the ancient Greeks, the sea wasn't just a pathway, it was destiny. Cradled by the Aegean, Ionian, and Mediterranean seas, Greek civilization emerged in a world where sailing was as essential as farming. From the age of Homeric epics to the height of Athenian naval dominance, the Greeks turned maritime culture into art, science, and strategy, their earliest stories. Those of Odysseus battling sea monsters and Jason chasing the Golden Fleece weren't mere myths. They were reflections of a people intimately tied to the sea. Greek city-states like Athens, Corinth, and Rhodes all relied on the ocean, not just for trade, but for identity. Their gods had dominion over waves. Their heroes set sail. Their empires floated on hulls of wood and ambition by the 8th century BCE. Greek colonists were setting out across the Mediterranean, founding cities from Sicily to the Black Sea coast. These colonies weren't military outposts. They were trade hubs, cultural satellites, and vital ports in a vast economic web. Goods flowed both ways: olive oil, wine, and pottery from Greece, grain, metals, and slaves from afar. To navigate, Greek sailors relied heavily on coastal sight lines, the stars. Especially the rising and setting of specific constellations and oral navigation knowledge passed through generations. Their ships evolved from simple merchant vessels to formidable war machines like the trireme, a sleek three-tier galley rowed by up to 170 men and armed with a bronze battering ram. The trireme was more than a ship. It was a floating expression of Athenian democracy and power at its peak in the 5th century BCE. Athens boasted the most powerful navy in the ancient world. The Delian League, originally a defensive alliance against Persia, became an Athenian-led maritime empire. Their navy ensured control over sea lanes, tributes from allied cities, and the free flow of resources into Athens, feeding its golden age of philosophy, architecture, and drama. But with power came vulnerability. The Peloponnesian War against Sparta saw Athens' over-reliance on sea dominance backfire. Naval defeats, blockades, and internal strife brought about its downfall. Still, the legacy endured. Greek maritime innovations in cartography, celestial navigation, and shipbuilding laid the groundwork for Roman and later European seafaring, and their belief that the sea was a stage for glory, knowledge, and tragedy echoes in Western thought even today. For a people who started as landlocked farmers and shepherds, the Romans were late to embrace the sea. But once they did, they didn't just join the naval powers of the ancient world. They crushed them. The Mediterranean, once a patchwork of rival fleets and scattered colonies, became what the Romans proudly called Mare Nostrum, or sea. Early Rome was no maritime superpower. The Etruscans and Greeks dominated Italy's coasts, while Carthage, founded by Phoenician settlers, ruled the western Mediterranean with the most formidable navy in the region. But everything changed during the Punic Wars. Faced with Carthage's naval superiority, the Romans made a bold move. They reverse-engineered captured Carthaginian warship. In an astonishing feat of industrial determination, they built an entire fleet, hundreds of ships, in mere months. But they added something uniquely Roman. The Corvus, the boarding bridge that turned sea battles into land combat. This innovation played to Rome's strength in infantry, allowing legionaries to storm enemy ships as if they were charging a fortress. Victory over Carthage in the Punic Wars handed Rome not only naval dominance, but also control over Sicily, Sardinia, Spain, and eventually the entire Mediterranean coastline. Roman galleys, both military and merchant, patrolled sea lanes, transporting grain, troops, and exotic goods from Egypt, Gaul, Syria, and beyond. Ports like Ostia and Alexandria bustled with activity, turning the Mediterranean into a Roman highway. The Pax Romana, a period of relative peace lasting 2 centuries, was made possible largely through this maritime control. The sea, once a place of pirate fleets and clashing empires, became a stabilized zone of commerce. Grain shipments fed the capital. Luxury goods, silk, spices, pearls flowed in from India and China via maritime routes stretching to the Red Sea and Persian Gulf. Roman sailors used a combination of dead reckoning, coastal sailing, and celestial navigation, aided by detailed maritime itineraries known as periploi. Though lacking compasses, they mastered the rhythms of wind and current, especially the Audition winds that made return voyages in the eastern Mediterranean predictable. Rome didn't just conquer by land, it sustained itself by sea. Its navy protected trade, enforced imperial will, and ensured communication across vast distances. With their fleets, the Romans did what no other culture had yet managed. They turned the chaotic sea into a controlled empire long before modern maps, compasses, and diesel engines. The ancient world was already connected by an invisible latticework of sea routes drawn not with ink, but with wind, memory, and stars. From the reed boats of the Nile to the double-hulled canoes of the Pacific, these early maritime cultures didn't just explore the seas, they defined them. And their legacy still lingers in every port, every trade route, and every ship that crosses the waves today. The knowledge passed down by Minoans, Phoenicians, Austronesians, Egyptians, and others became the bedrock of future navigation. These cultures discovered how to read the sky like a map, how to sail with the rhythms of the earth, and how to build ships that could survive months at sea, all without metal hulls or written charts. Their discoveries weren't isolated. They were cumulative. Each seafaring civilization learned from its predecessors or neighbors, contributing a new stitch in the tapestry of global navigation. Phoenician alphabets enabled the record-keeping necessary for complex maritime trade. Austronesian navigation traditions, preserved orally for generations, inspired 20th-century efforts to revive wayfinding without instruments. Greek observations of the stars and winds laid the groundwork for ancient geography. Roman engineering gave us ports and lighthouses still echoed in today's harbor design. Even more significant than the tools were the connections. Maritime routes allowed ideas to travel faster than armies. Religions spread by sea. So did technology, crops, language, and diseases. The maritime cultures of the ancient world didn't just move objects, they moved civilizations without them. The ancient Silk Roads would have stopped at the shoreline. Without them, empires might never have risen, and distant peoples might have remained strangers forever. And yet, for all their accomplishments, so many of these early sailors remain nameless. Their stories were rarely written down. Their ships decayed and vanished. What survives are fragments, pottery shards in a sunken cargo hold, a port structure buried beneath modern concrete, a star map etched on bone or bark, but their impact still moves with the tide. Every container ship crossing the Suez Canal, every satellite-guided cargo run across the Pacific, every naval patrol in the Mediterranean owes something to those first brave souls who dared to chase the horizon. They may have been ancient, but they were never primitive. They were the original navigators of the human story. In the ancient world, royal birth was a blessing wrapped in a curse. The instant a child was born into a palace, they became more than a person. They became a symbol, a political weapon, and the future of an empire. Their education didn't begin in a classroom. It began in the nursery, surrounded by whispers of lineage, legacy, and looming threats, unlike common children, who learned survival through labor. Elite children were groomed for leadership from the start. Every gesture they made, every word they spoke was watched, corrected, and crafted. Their lives were performances in training, rehearsals for thrones they had not yet earned. They didn't learn to read for leisure. They learned so they could read treaties. They didn't learn to speak to express themselves. They learned to command obedience, recite laws, and deliver carefully calculated flattery to foreign envoys. The content of their education depended heavily on geography and dynasty, but the goals were universal control, charisma, and continuity. A Babylonian prince might be drilled in cuneiform by scribes, while an Egyptian heir would be introduced to priestly hieroglyphs, rituals, and sacred myths. In Greece, philosophy was essential. In Persia, etiquette was military. In China, Confucianism ruled the curriculum. Even their toys were political. Miniature weapons, board games, simulating strategy, and symbolic animals reflected the roles they were expected to master. Tutors weren't just teachers, they were handlers. Carefully chosen by the court, they were loyal, elite, and often expendable. If the royal child failed, it was the tutor who paid the price. The stakes were always high. A poorly educated heir was a national liability. A soft or ill-prepared child could become a pawn in the hands of enemies or ambitious relatives. Education, then, wasn't about personal development. It was about regime survival. But for all its strictness, royal education could also be dazzling. These children were exposed to astronomy, medicine, foreign languages, ethics, and art long before the rest of the world. Some of them became polymaths, statesmen, generals, and scholars raised not just to rule, but to outshine every mind in the room. To be born royal in the ancient world wasn't just to be born lucky, it was to be born into a lifelong test, and education was the first battlefield. Behind every powerful ruler in the ancient world was often a far more obscure figure, the tutor. These weren't just glorified babysitters. They were philosophers, priests, generals, and political operatives. Their task? To shape a child not just into an adult, but into a ruler, a diplomat, and sometimes a god. Few tutor-student pairings have echoed louder through history than that of Aristotle and Alexander the Great. Chosen by Philip of Macedon, Aristotle was tasked with turning the headstrong prince into something more than just a warrior. He taught him ethics, rhetoric, zoology, geography, and philosophy, and infused him with an insatiable hunger for knowledge. When Alexander later conquered the known world, he carried copies of Homer and philosophical texts with him like sacred weapons. Aristotle hadn't just taught him facts, he had crafted the inner world of a future conqueror. But Aristotle was no exception in the Roman Empire. Seneca, the Stoic philosopher and statesman, was assigned to tutor the young Nero. He tried to shape the boy with virtue, logic, and restraint. Unfortunately, history tells us that Nero grew into one of Rome's most infamous tyrants. The failure wasn't entirely Seneca's, but it showed how even the best teachers couldn't always overcome a student's darker instincts or courtly influence. In Persia, royal tutors were often military men, chosen for their loyalty and their ability to instill discipline. Princes of the Achaemenid dynasty were taught hunting, horseback riding, and combat from the age of 7, alongside moral training in truthfulness and justice, all under the watchful eyes of elite mentors. Their education was practical, Spartan, and deeply political. In ancient China, Confucian scholars held enormous sway over the upbringing of princes. They instilled ideals of filial piety, hierarchy, and ritual. But woe to the tutor who taught the wrong thing. A slip of the tongue could lead to banishment or death if a lesson contradicted the emperor's doctrine. Being a royal tutor meant living in the shadows, shaping history through someone else's mouth and hand. They had to be wise but invisible, commanding yet deferential. They walked a dangerous line, got too close, and they were envied. Fail, and they were discarded. Succeed, and their names lived on only if their students made history. While the sons and daughters of farmers learned from life, elite children of the ancient world learned from systems built behind palace walls, private academies, temple libraries, and in some cases, secret priestly schools that protected knowledge like it was gold. Education for royals wasn't just about preparing for power, it was about controlling the flow of knowledge. The one thing more dangerous than armies. In ancient Egypt, priesthoods were the gatekeepers of education. Royal children, especially future pharaohs, were sometimes educated in temple schools where instruction included reading hieroglyphs, memorizing religious texts, understanding ritual practice, and learning astronomy and medicine. These were not skills shared with the general public. Literacy was rare, sacred, and only those destined to govern or interpret the divine were granted access. Much of this training was conducted in what we might call secret schools. Within temples like those at Karnak or Heliopolis, knowledge was transmitted from priest to pupil in complete confidentiality. The curriculum wasn't just religious, it was political. Knowing how to recite spells, interpret omens, or plan rituals gave rulers control over life and death in the eyes of their people. Persia had its own elite educational structure. The sons of Persian nobility, especially those close to the king, were educated in what Herodotus called the king's school. Hidden from public view, these boys learned truth-telling, writing, archery, and leadership. They also absorbed Zoroastrian ethics and statecraft. This schooling wasn't just for princes, it was for future satraps, generals, and administrators. Men expected to control provinces and armies with unwavering loyalty. In India, royal children might attend gurukulas, secluded forest schools run by learned Brahmins. While commoners rarely had access, princes were often placed under the guidance of a single guru, who taught them everything from Vedic hymns to martial skills. The education was holistic, spiritual, intellectual, and physical, and again, deeply hierarchical. Knowledge was tailored to caste, role, and destiny. Even in Greece, where education was more democratized in some cities, elite children like those in Sparta or Athens received specialized training. Spartan royal sons were placed in the Agog, the state-run military academy. Athenian aristocrats hired private tutors in logic, strategy, and rhetoric, because knowing how to win a war was only half the battle. Knowing how to win an argument could be even more important. In all these worlds, knowledge wasn't merely taught. It was guarded, passed like a sword, meant only for those who could wield it. In the ancient world, royal women were rarely expected to lead armies or govern states, but that didn't mean their education was trivial. In fact, for many dynasties, the instruction of elite daughters was just as calculated and strategic as that of their brothers. Because royal women weren't only daughters, they were future queens, priestesses, political pawns, and sometimes power players in Egypt. Royal women could hold immense influence. Queens like Hatshepsut and Nefertiti didn't merely stand beside pharaohs. They ruled, built temples, and engaged in diplomacy. This required education. Princesses in Egypt were often taught by temple priests in reading hieroglyphs, reciting religious texts, managing estates, and performing sacred rituals. Those destined to become God's wives of Ammonius were initiated into priestly orders, learning rites and theology far beyond the reach of commoners. Some even participated in governance with knowledge that rivaled their male counterparts. In Persia, royal women were kept behind palace curtains, but they weren't idle. The Achaemenid queens were entrusted with managing vast estates, overseeing treasuries, and maintaining courtly alliances. To do so, they were taught bookkeeping, diplomacy, and political etiquette. Greek historians like Xenophon note how Persian queens engaged in behind-the-scenes governance, indicating a quiet but formidable education. In ancient Greece, the story is mixed. In Athens, education for women, even elite ones, was minimal and domestic music, weaving, household management, and some reading. But in Sparta, royal women were raised for strength. They trained in physical fitness, rhetoric, and Spartan values. A Spartan princess could speak her mind and command estates while her husband waged war. And when Spartan men died young in battle, it was often the women who upheld the legacy. In India and China, noblewomen's education reflected religious and dynastic priorities. In the Gupta Empire, royal daughters were sometimes schooled in Sanskrit, music, poetry, and philosophy, skills designed to enhance their allure and status. In imperial China, empresses and consorts were taught Confucian ethics, calligraphy, and palace protocol. Those destined for political roles, like Empress Lu Ji or Wu Zetian, went far beyond mastering governance, surveillance, and statecraft under the guise of etiquette. Royal women walked a delicate path. They were expected to charm, not rule, but when circumstances changed, they often stepped into power. And when they did, their education wasn't a frill. It was their arsenal. If swords won battles, speech won empires. In the ancient world, the royals' ability to speak wasn't a soft skill. It was a weapon. Language, rhetoric, and public persuasion were essential tools of rule, diplomacy, and survival. And so elite children weren't merely taught to speak. They were trained to captivate, manipulate, and command through words. Nowhere was this clearer than in ancient Greece, where rhetoric was seen as the hallmark of a civilized leader. Athenian aristocrats learned from masters like Isocrates and later the Sophists, who taught persuasive speech as both an art and a science. Young elites practiced delivering speeches, debating in public forums, and mastering logos, pathos, and ethos, the pillars of classical persuasion. For those raised to govern, a sharp tongue could be more useful than a sharp blade. This ideal spread across cultures. In Rome, elite boys were taught oratory from a young age. They memorized Cicero's speeches, learned courtroom strategy, and practiced delivering arguments while maintaining poise and decorum. For imperial heirs, this wasn't just about courtly performance, it was about survival. A poorly timed phrase could invite scandal. A brilliant speech could sway the Senate. Even in monarchies where absolute power reigned, words still mattered. In Egypt, the pharaoh was seen as a divine speaker. His proclamations carried ritual and legal weight. Royal children learned formal language and ceremonial formulas, reciting them during religious processions and state rituals. In Mesopotamia, scribal schools taught elite children not only how to write, but how to write persuasively, crafting royal decrees, diplomatic letters, and mythic hymns. In Persia and India, language played a different but equally a vital role. Persian princes were trained in multiple tongues, Old Persian for court, Aramaic for diplomacy, and sometimes Greek or Median. They learned how to negotiate, compliment, and intimidate with tone and timing. Indian royal students, especially under the Maurya and Gupta empires, studied Sanskrit epics and philosophical texts like the Arthashastra, which offered tactical lessons in rhetoric, espionage, and diplomacy. Even in cultures where oral tradition reigned, like among Celtic and Germanic elites, storytelling and speech-making were forms of authority. A prince who couldn't speak well couldn't lead because in the end, power wasn't just taken. It was spoken into existence. For ancient royals, the sky was not just a canvas of stars. It was a calendar, a compass, a clock, and sometimes a divine script. And beneath that sky, the numbers mattered. Mathematics and astronomy weren't optional subjects for royal heirs. They were foundational disciplines that shaped how a ruler understood time, taxes, architecture, war, and even fate itself. In Mesopotamia, long before Pythagoras was a household name, Babylonian elites were studying base 60 math systems, predicting eclipses and calculating planetary movements with astonishing precision. Royal scribes and priest astronomers were often tutors to princes, teaching them to read cuneiform tablets filled with data on stars, weather, and omens. These calculations weren't abstract. They had real consequences for when to wage war, plant crops, or perform royal rituals. Egyptian royal education also wove mathematics into nearly every sphere of power. Pharaohs needed to understand land measurement for taxation after Nile floods. They also had to oversee monumental building projects, temples, tombs and pyramids, requiring geometric knowledge and logistical skill. Astronomy guided Egypt's religious calendar, and royal children were taught to track the heliacal rising of Sirius, which heralded the annual inundation and marked the start of the year. In ancient India, members of the royal class were exposed to the deep mathematical traditions found in texts like the Sulbasutras and later Aryabhata's work on algebra and planetary motion. Astronomy was both scientific and spiritual, essential for aligning rituals and interpreting omens. A wise king consulted the stars, but an educated one could interpret them himself. The Greeks refined these teachings, making them more systematic and philosophical. A Macedonian prince like Alexander would study arithmetic and astronomy alongside ethics and logic. Greek royal education, influenced by thinkers like Plato and Aristotle, treated mathematics as a gateway to understanding the order of the cosmos, and by extension, one's place as a ruler within it. Even the Chinese imperial courts relied heavily on astronomy. Emperors were seen as cosmic intermediaries, and the ability to predict celestial events validated their divine right to rule. Court astronomers were powerful figures, and princes were educated in lunar cycles, eclipse prediction, and calendar reform. In every culture, the educated ruler didn't just rule over people, they ruled over time, space, and destiny. And math and the stars were their silent advisors. Books could crown a ruler, but swords kept them on the throne. For ancient royalty, education didn't end in the classroom. It extended to the battlefield, where courage, physical mastery, and strategic skill were as vital as philosophy or statecraft. Elite children, especially male heirs, were raised with one unspoken truth. If you cannot defend your kingdom, someone else will take it. In Sparta, this belief was that royal sons entered the Agog, the state's brutal military academy, by age 7. They were stripped of comfort and trained in pain tolerance, endurance, hand-to-hand combat, and battlefield tactics. Even princes were not spared. They fought, bled, and survived alongside other Spartan boys, forging a bond through hardship that would serve them on the front lines. In Persia, royal boys were educated in the 3 R's of nobility: riding, archery, and truth-telling. Horsemanship was essential not only for war, but also for royal hunting expeditions, which doubled as strategic drills. Archery was more than a skill. It was a symbol of discipline, focus, and martial prowess. A Persian prince who couldn't handle a bow was unfit to rule. India's warrior classes, such as the Kshatriyas, were trained from a young age in Dhanaveda, the martial science. Royal children learned to wield swords, spears, maces, and bows. They also studied the philosophies of war through epics like the Mahabharata, which taught not just how to fight, but why to fight, and what honor is required in the face of death. Egyptian and Mesopotamian princes were also expected to be commanders. They practiced chariot driving, spear throwing, and wrestling under the guidance of military officers. Pharaohs were often depicted smiting enemies, but that theatrical image was grounded in real training. War wasn't theoretical. Rulers led from the front. In Rome, the young patrician elite were taught both virtues, manly courage, and discipline. They trained with wooden swords, learned formations, and read military histories. Julius Caesar wasn't just a scholar, he was a hardened general, trained to balance pen and sword from youth. Even Chinese princes, often more insulated by bureaucracy, practiced martial arts, archery, and horseback riding as part of their princely curriculum. The ruler was expected to embody both the civil and the military ideal, the one and the wu. In every empire, education in warfare wasn't optional. It was survival. For a royal child, a misplaced word could start a war. A glance held too long could spark a scandal. In ancient courts, knowing how to sit, speak, and smile was as much a weapon as wielding a sword. Etiquette wasn't fluff, it was strategy. Behind every bow and banquet was a game of survival. And royal education drilled this into the ears of empires. From China to Persia, court etiquette was codified to a level of near paralysis. In Han China, princes were expected to memorize and observe the Li ritual codes dictating everything from how to greet a superior to how to mourn properly. A single breach of protocol could be interpreted as rebellion. Young royals were taught to move with precision, to speak with restraint, and to read the power dynamics in every room. In Persia, royal children were schooled in the art of courtly appearance. This included not just dress and manners, but also how to handle envoys, deflect insults, and respond with poise under pressure. They were trained in indirect communication, mastering the political doublespeak necessary to survive in a palace filled with spies and sycophants. In India, Nata Shastra, the science of politics and ethics, was a key part of elite education. Texts like the Arthashastra outlined how a king must navigate betrayal, use informants, and maintain a balance between diplomacy and force. Royal heirs were expected to understand these concepts early, because one wrong alliance or naive gesture could cost them their throne or their life. The Greeks and Romans, too, took court behavior seriously. Athenian elites were schooled in charis, personal charm, and grace. While Roman boys learned the art of flattery, public conduct, and surveillance, Julius Caesar wasn't just trained to fight. He was taught how to win over senators, undermine rivals, and read a man's ambition by his tone. In Egypt, etiquette blurred with divinity. The pharaoh wasn't just royalty, he was a god. Royal children were taught to behave with serene dignity at all times, their bodies seen as symbols of cosmic order. Even their posture mattered. Their stillness wasn't passivity. It was power in silence. And always beneath the manners and rituals lay espionage. Tutors often taught princes how to test loyalty, gather secrets, and spot deception. Because in every palace someone was always watching, and survival depended on watching back. A royal education was never just about shaping a child. It was about shaping the future of a dynasty. For ancient elites, every lesson in logic, battle, etiquette, and language carried the weight of generations. A well-educated ruler could unite kingdoms, stabilize empires, and earn immortality in marble and myth. A poorly prepared one could unravel everything. In many ways, royal education was the empire's gamble on itself. Every coin minted, every scroll copied, every tutor hired was an investment in a single person's ability to hold the realm together. And the pressure on that child, whether prince, princess, or pawn, was immense. Take Alexander the Great. His conquest of half the known world wasn't just fueled by ambition or cavalry tactics. It was rooted in years of tailored instruction under Aristotle, who instilled in him a thirst for knowledge, debate, and divine destiny. Alexander didn't merely conquer. He carried with him Greek culture, science, and diplomacy, becoming a symbol of Hellenistic unification. Contrast that with Nero, who was also rigorously trained by none other than the Stoic philosopher Seneca. He had every educational advantage Rome could offer, yet still descended into cruelty, paranoia, and excess. His failure wasn't just personal. It cast a shadow over the Roman imperial image, igniting revolts and tarnishing Rome's authority for years. Education, it turned out, was not a guarantee. It was a crucible for royal women. The stakes were no less grave. A queen consort could become regent. A princess could be married off as a peace offering or rise to rule in her own right. The education of figures like Cleopatra or Wu Zetian wasn't a luxury. It was preparation for an empire. Their ability to speak multiple languages, manage treasuries, and navigate deadly court politics kept them alive and in power. Even long after their deaths, the impact of these royal educations endured. Many rulers became patrons of learning, founding academies, libraries, and temples of knowledge. Their own childhood instruction became the model for future generations, repeated, refined, and ritualized. In the end, the education of the royal child was never just about the child. It was about legacy, about ensuring the past didn't die, and that the future could be ruled with wisdom, not just force. Because in the ancient world, the throne was inherited, but the ability to keep it had to be taught. So you've heard a sermon, a loud, passionate, vaguely threatening sermon delivered by a man in robes, shouting about sin, salvation, and how Jerusalem is technically everyone's business. You're not exactly sure where Jerusalem is. Somewhere east of France, south of your pig farm. You're not anyway. The Pope himself has declared that anyone who joins the crusade will receive full forgiveness of sins. That sounds like a good deal, especially after what you did last spring behind the millhouse. You didn't think God saw that, but apparently he keeps receipts. Also, let's be honest, you're bored. You've plowed the same field for 14 years. Your diet consists entirely of barley, onions, and whatever didn't escape the stew pot. Someone mentions eternal glory, and frankly, that sounds better than milking goats in the rain again. So you sign up. Or rather, you get roped in during a tavern conversation that escalates into a holy oath after 3 mugs of weak ale and a misplaced sense of invincibility. You wake up the next morning, hungover, holding a wooden cross in someone else's boots. Still, you feel proud. You're now officially a crusader. You've got a patch sewn onto your tunic, a blessing from a priest, and the vague idea that all of this will end with you being showered in gold and gratitude. You've also been given exactly no military training, no map, and your armor. You don't have any. You were told to bring what you can, so now you're armed with a kitchen knife, a frying pan, and whatever's left of your dignity. Your neighbor Gerald brought a rake and a really aggressive attitude. You tell your family you're leaving in the name of God. They ask if God will be feeding you along the way. You laugh. You shouldn't have, because you are now part of one of the most disorganized, poorly planned mass movements in human history. You're marching thousands of miles with no logistics, no reliable supply line, and more spiritual confidence than common sense. And you haven't even left your village yet. But hey, what could possibly go wrong? Before you even step out of your village, someone hands you a chainmail shirt that smells like it lost a bet. You were promised armor. Noble, shining, heroic. What you get is a hand-me-down iron sweater with rust stains, sweat stains, and a lingering scent of disappointment. It's heavy. Not, oh, this is a bit bulky heavy. We're talking, this is a wearable blacksmith shop heavy. Just putting it on feels like being hugged by a sullen anvil. You've also received a helmet, conical, dented, and clearly designed by someone who hated necks. There's no padding inside, just cold metal and the gentle sensation of your skull being slow cooked. For your legs, you get wool, just wool. There are no armored greaves unless you're wealthy or very lucky. You are neither. You wrap your legs like a sad present and hope it absorbs some of the pain from the thousands of rocks you're about to step on. And footwear. If you're expecting boots of hardened leather and heroism, think again. You're wearing worn-out turn shoes, soft leather slippers that barely protect you from mud, let alone battlefield conditions. Within the first mile, you got a blister that's thinking of opening its own church. Also, the surcoat, the brightly colored fabric worn over your armor to signal your side, is white. Or rather, it used to be. Now it's vaguely beige with mysterious spots, and it flaps like a wet flag every time you walk. It features a red cross, painted on hastily by a guy who also sharpens pigs. There's no consistency across the army. One guy is in full mail, another's wearing a pot on his head. Gerald, again, is shirtless, with a wooden shield he carved himself. It says, Jesus, watch this in bad Latin. You try to tie your belt, but end up cinching it too tight and nearly passing out. Your sword, if you were lucky enough to borrow one, is dull, unbalanced, and seems to actively dislike you. But still you tell yourself, I look like a knight. You don't. You look like a scared turnip wrapped in steel and optimism. But it's too late now. You're packed, dressed, and completely unprepared. Time to march. The trumpets sound. Or maybe it's just a guy yelling. Either way, the crusade is moving, and so are you. Very slowly, very uncomfortably. This isn't a glorious cavalry charge. This is a long, groaning shuffle across Europe, with thousands of confused, underfed people dragging carts, goats, children, and at least one man who insists on bringing a piano. Everyone's armed, but only some of the weapons were designed for combat. One man is marching with a pitchfork. Another has tied a hammer to a broomstick and calls it God's toothpick. You've barely left the village, and your shoulders already feel like they've been cursed. The chainmail digs into your neck, your boots are turning your feet into soup, and your pack, containing exactly 2 onions and an old biscuit, weighs more with every step. Someone sneezes behind you. You consider fleeing. Then there's the noise. Everyone's talking, arguing, praying, singing, or coughing. A nobleman rides past and yells something inspirational, like forward men, before disappearing for the rest of the day. Meanwhile, you trip over a rock, sprain your dignity, and get stepped on by a passing donkey. The sun is out. It's cheerful. You are not. You're sweating in places you didn't know had sweat glands. Your thighs are chafing in a way that feels like divine punishment. Your water is already warm and tastes like iron and regret. There are rules, of course, but no one's following them. March in ranks. Too late. Someone's already wandered into a beet field. Ration your food. Gerald just ate his entire week's supply before lunch. Respect local villagers. You try until you realize they're charging half a chicken just to use the well, and then the rains come. Just as you think you might be adapting, the skies open like a sarcastic baptism. Your surcoat clings to you like guilt. The roads become mudslides. You fall twice, once forward, once backward. The goat laughs. By nightfall, you've walked 12 miles and aged 12 years. You lie down in wet grass next to a man you don't know, and whose snoring may be weaponized. You sleep like a brick in a bucket, poorly and with consequences. Only 2,000 miles to go. By day 4, your stomach is singing hymns for food. Loud, desperate hymns. The kind you usually only hear at funerals. You were told the army had supplies. Technically, that's true. It's just that those supplies are either moldy, missing, or currently being hoarded by someone named Brother Ulrich, who insists he's fasting for spiritual clarity while chewing suspiciously in the dark. Breakfast, if you're lucky, is a hunk of black bread so dense it could be used as siege equipment. You chew it for 20 minutes, make no progress, and end up just sort of gnawing until your teeth get bored. Your companion claims his bread has a nail in it. No one is surprised. Lunch is worse. There is no lunch. There is only a distant memory of lunch. You eat a handful of dried peas, which taste like despair and medieval dust. A man next to you proudly produces a salted fish he's been carrying in his sock. You politely decline and consider fasting for spiritual clarity. By late afternoon, everyone is hangry and hallucinating. One guy thinks he sees a fig tree. It's actually a scarecrow. Another man starts licking his sword, claiming it. Tastes of glory. It tastes of rust. He now has tetanus. The real problem is that feeding an army on the move is, technically speaking, a logistical nightmare. The supply lines are long, badly managed, and occasionally attacked by the local peasantry, who would rather not donate their entire winter food store to a bunch of crusaders who just trampled their turnips. So you forage. You find a bush with berries. Gerald says they're fine. Gerald also once ate a candle, so you take your chances. They are not fine. You spend the next 2 hours behind a tree, questioning everything. Dinner is stew. Glorious, mysterious stew. No one knows what's in it. Everyone eats it anyway. You find something chewy. You do not ask questions. Someone claims it's a rabbit. Someone else says boot leather. Both are plausible. By nightfall, you're full. Not of food, just of regret. You dream of bread that doesn't fight back and cheese that isn't green on purpose. You've never missed your mother's onion soup more. And it's only day 4. At this point in the journey, it's official. You smell like a combination of wet iron, regret, and something you hope isn't fungal. Hygiene, once a noble goal, has now been demoted to a vague memory, like clean socks or personal boundaries. You haven't bathed in over a week. Neither has anyone else. You know this because the entire crusading force has started to develop what historians call a strong collective aroma. You're all one big walking cheese wheel of sweat, dust, and medieval body odor. There's no soap. If someone claims to have soap, they're lying, or they've carved it from tallow and self-delusion. You do have water occasionally, but it's mostly reserved for drinking or pouring on open wounds while screaming. Wash your body with it. That's a luxury reserved for nobles and people with significantly fewer blisters. Your clothes, once proudly stitched with a red cross, now resemble a battlefield in fabric form. Your undergarments have fused to your skin in certain areas. Your boots are damp, possibly alive, and definitely angry. Mice. Oh yes, they've moved in. You name them. You try negotiating with them. They are winning. One knight is convinced his helmet is haunted. It's just head lice throwing a party. You start itching at night. Everyone does. It becomes the unofficial marching rhythm. Scratch, scratch, shuffle, groan. You briefly consider bathing in a river. You approach the water and realize it is freezing, filthy, and already occupied by someone crying into their underpants. You nod respectfully and walk away. And bodily functions. There are no latrines. You go where you can, behind bushes, under wagons, or just wherever dignity officially gives up. Privacy? Absolutely not. You now have contact stories with strangers you'll never forget. There's one guy, nobody knows his name, who somehow manages to remain clean. His armor gleams. His face is clear. He smells like lavender. He is either a miracle or a hallucination. Either way, you hate him deeply. You start to dream of soap, of bathtubs, of dry feet. But mostly you dream of a breeze that doesn't smell like 30 men and one regrettable stew. You're not clean. You're not even close. You're crusade clean. You thought enemies with swords were your biggest problem. No. It's the guy 3 rows back who just coughed something biblical into the air. Welcome to the real crusade, surviving your fellow crusaders' immune systems. Medieval medicine is less science and more interpretive dance with herbs. If you fall ill, you can expect one of 3 treatments: prayer, bleeding, or being told to walk it off. Spoiler: none of these work, especially when what you've got is spreading faster than gossip at a monastery. It starts innocently enough. The sniffle here, the cough there. Someone throws up behind a bush. Everyone pretends not to notice. By the next day, 5 more are coughing. Gerald has developed something alarming and purple on his neck. He insists it's just a heat rash. You begin planning your own funeral. Tents quickly become infirmaries, or as they're known in the crusade, places where hope goes to ease quietly. The healers are overwhelmed. Their main tools are cloth bandages, leeches, and conviction. Sometimes they burn herbs. Sometimes they just wave them near your face and hope you improve out of sheer awkwardness. And the symptoms are not subtle. Fever, chills, nausea, swelling, and a general sensation that your organs have gone on strike. You try to be brave. Then you see someone being cured with a hot poker. And decide you're suddenly feeling much better, actually. Sanitation is, shall we say, theoretical. Waste disposal. Random fields. Water. Questionable at best. Weaponized at worst. You refill your flask from a stream, only to spot 3 horses upstream using it as a toilet. You drink it anyway. Hydration is hydration. The priests say it's a test from God. The knights say it's the devil. The barmaid who tagged along for some reason says because no one ever washes their hands. She is immediately ignored. Obviously. You try to keep your distance from the sick until you realize everyone is sick, including you. Your throat burns. Your stomach is sending mixed messages. You consider your chances of survival and remember your last bath was last month. The math is not in your favor. And the worst part, you still haven't fought anyone yet. You're losing a war. To soup germs. You've been marching for days, hungry, itchy, mildly diseased, and now you're expecting a warm welcome from the towns and villages along the way. Spoiler: you won't get it. The locals are less than thrilled. In fact, they look at your crusading party the same way a shepherd looks at wolves wearing crosses. Suspicious, tense, ready to hide the livestock. From their point of view, you're a moving catastrophe. Thousands of unwashed strangers shouting in broken Latin, trampling crops, borrowing everything that isn't nailed down, and singing war hymns at midnight like tone-deaf demons. You're not a holy army. You're a walking plague parade. You stop at a town hoping to trade for food. The villagers bar the gates. The local bishop peeks out from a tower and makes the sign of the cross on you. A monk offers a single cabbage in exchange for you leaving faster. Language barriers don't help. You try asking for water, but accidentally demand someone's wife. You attempt to explain your holy mission and somehow end up proposing to a goat. The goat is not interested. Negotiations break down quickly. If you do manage to get inside a settlement, it's usually followed by price gouging, staring, and someone making passive-aggressive comments about your odor. You buy bread that's older than your shoes and ale that double S's varnish. Someone gives you directions to Jerusalem. You follow them for 2 days before realizing they were just trying to send you to the next village. And if you're in foreign territory, oh, it gets even better. The locals don't just dislike you. They actively want you gone. They don't care about your papal blessings or your homemade flag. They just want their goats' fields and general peace back. And considering some of these places were recently raided by other crusading parties who swore they were just passing through, trust is at an all-time low. In one town, a child throws a turnip at your head. It's the most accurate projectile you've seen all week. You came seeking salvation. They see you as a broke, heavily armed tourist with boundary issues. And honestly, they're not wrong. So you're finally on the move again. Marching east. Probably. Maybe. The truth is, no one's actually sure where they're going. There are no GPS devices, no RD, signs that say this way to Jerusalem, and most of the people in your group think the Holy Land is just slightly past Constantinople, which they also can't find. Your commander has a map. Sort of. It's a hand-drawn scroll with 3 towns, 2 rivers, and what appears to be a dragon in the corner. You suspect the artist had a vivid imagination and poor geography skills. Still, the commander waves it around like it's the word of God and yells forward at every fork in the road. Confidence, apparently, is more important than accuracy. Every now and then, a local guide is recruited. He's offered a few coins, a goatskin of wine, and a vague promise not to be trampled. He nods sagely, points east, and then vanishes before breakfast. You're beginning to think he just means not here. One guy swears he remembers the way from a dream. Another says he read a scroll once. Gerald, still shirtless and increasingly sunburned, claims he's following divine whispers carried by the wind. The wind seems to be saying you're lost. You cross the same stream 3 times in one day. You pass a rock you're pretty sure you already passed. A monk insists it's a different rock. This one is holier. You remain unconvinced. The terrain changes constantly. Forest, swamp, mountains. One stretch of RD is so steep your boots slide more than they step. Half the army is now walking sideways like confused crabs. Spirits are low, feet are lower, and then someone says the worst thing imaginable. I think we took a wrong turn. You're hundreds of miles from home, surrounded by people who think cartography is a kind of pastry, and no one wants to admit they're lost. So you keep marching proudly, aimlessly, faithfully. Every direction leads somewhere, whether it's Jerusalem, Byzantine outpost, or another unfortunate goat village is anyone's guess. But onward you go, fueled by divine purpose, stale bread, and a collective refusal to admit you're walking in a very large circle. You thought it would be glorious. You imagined banners waving, swords clashing with poetic timing, and your enemies falling in choreographed heaps like a troubadour's epic. What you actually get is dirt in your mouth, noise in your soul, and a deeply unsettling realization that no one knows what they're doing. The first thing you notice is the screaming, not just from the enemy, not just from your side, from everyone you included. There's battle strategy, of course, but it mostly involves yelling charge and hoping the other guy is more confused than you are. Spoiler. He's not. Your helmet blocks your vision. Your sword is too heavy. You try to raise your shield and realize it's on the ground behind you because Gerald borrowed it to cook bacon and forgot to give it back. Archers fire before anyone's ready. The front line surges forward while the back line panics and surges back. Someone gets trampled by his own horse. Someone else is fighting with a frying pan. You see a man trip, stab himself in the foot, and start blaming the devil. Honestly, he might be right. You run toward the chaos because everyone else is doing it, and social pressure is powerful. Dust fills there. You swing wildly. You hit a helmet. It's your own. You scream. It's very brave. The enemy is fast, skilled, and loud. You lock eyes with one and realize, horrifyingly, he's about 15 and significantly more experienced than you. You consider playing dead. You consider actually being dead. Both are tempting. There are horns blowing, commands shouted in 5 different languages. and someone singing what sounds like a tavern song about sheep. It's unclear if this is intimidation or madness. Either way, it's working after a while, and you have no idea how long. The noise subsides. The survivors crawl away, panting, bruised, and smelling like old stew and bad choices. You're one of them somehow. You're bleeding from the ankle. You don't remember how. Gerald has your helmet now. He's using it as a soup bowl. So was it glorious? Not exactly. But you're alive. And in the Crusades, that's about as close to victory as most people ever get. The weather in the Holy Land, or more accurately, the long winding disaster parade to the Holy Land, is not your friend. It's not even an indifferent acquaintance. It is a full-blown enemy commander with better timing than your entire army. One moment, it's sweltering, the kind of heat that makes your chainmail feel like a cast iron oven designed by Satan. You sweat through your clothes, your armor, and your soul. Your leather boots sizzle against your skin. A nearby knight claims he saw a mirage of a tavern. You believe him. You saw it too. You both cry quietly. Then, just when you've accepted your fate as a roast pilgrim, the heavens shift. Clouds roll in like an angry bishop. The skies darken and suddenly rain. Not polite rain, not English drizzle. This is biblical. Angry, vengeful, thunder screaming from the sky. It's kind of raining. Your surcoat clings to your body like a wet shroud. Your feet squelch with every step, making you sound like a remorseful duck. Your tent collapses almost immediately. You try to find shelter under a tree, which turns out to be the preferred hangout of 3 equally soaked goats and one man who has given up entirely and is now reciting psalms to his knees. The roads dissolve into mud. You slip twice. Gerald slips 3 times, once face first into a cow patty. You don't laugh out loud, but your soul chuckles. Then the cold. Oh, the cold. Once the sun disappears, the desert flips its mood like a drunk baron at a feast. You go from sweating in your boots to shivering like a cursed tambourine. Your fingers stop working. Your sword now doubles as an ice sculpture. Your nose runs away from your face and joins another army. You think about building a fire. You fail repeatedly. The only thing drier than the wood is your morale. But hey, weather builds character, right? Unfortunately, character doesn't stop you from catching pneumonia while trying to scrape mud off your own eyebrow with a broken spoon. Welcome to crusading. You're not just fighting for the faith, you're fighting the entire atmosphere. And the atmosphere is winning. You came to fight the infidel. That was the whole pitch. A nice, simple battle between good and evil. Christian and non-Christian, one clean moral crusade. Except now you've realized something awkward. Half the people on your side can't even agree on which holy calendar to use, let alone which god hates who. You're from Western Europe, Latin-speaking, Roman Pope following, slightly smelly. And now you're encountering Byzantines who speak Greek, cross themselves differently, and view you with all the warmth of a suspicious cat. They're supposed to be your allies. In practice, they've locked the city gates and told you to wait outside politely with archers. The priest who joined your group says the Eastern Church is heretical. The Byzantine bishop says you're an illiterate goat herder who bathes too little and sins too much. You both nod and pretend to be civil while muttering spiritual threats under your breath. Then there are the locals, Christian Arabs, Armenian Christians, Syriac Christians. You thought everyone in the East was Muslim. Surprise? Now you're trying to tell friend from foe based on how they chant the Lord's Prayer. You're not great at it. You accidentally threaten a group of monks. They respond by setting your tent on fire. It gets worse. The Muslims. They're not one big army either. There are Fatimids, Seljuks, local warlords, all fighting each other when they're not too busy fighting you every time you think you understand who the enemy is. Someone changes flags and switches sides mid-campaign. One guy you were chasing last week is now sitting at your campfire, explaining regional politics and eating your last onion. Your commander tries to hold a meeting between different factions. It devolves into a shouting match over whose saint is better. Gerald suggests a duel. No one disagrees. And don't forget the internal drama. Knights arguing with bishops, nobles fighting over loot, peasants forming their own prayer groups. At one point, someone claims a vision of the Virgin Mary in a chicken coop and starts a splinter sect. They charge the wrong hill. Religious unity? That lasted 3 days. Now you're all just hoping no one stabs you over a liturgical disagreement about Lent. God may be on your side, but everyone else is on edge. You thought joining the crusade meant fighting alongside noble warriors, disciplined knights, and pious men devoted to a sacred cause. You were wrong. You are, in fact, marching with the strangest collection of people ever assembled outside of a tavern brawl. To your left is a toothless baker who brought a rolling pin instead of a weapon. To your right is a man named Tebble, who claims to be a monk but swears constantly, drinks anything in a jug, and has definitely stabbed someone over a loaf of bread. Gerald, still shirtless, has pinned a cross on his chest in soot and says he's God muscle. Your commanding officer is a 19-year-old noble with too much hair and zero strategy. He believes tactics means pointing dramatically and yelling. During one skirmish, he charged in the wrong direction and ended up in a cabbage field. He still insists it was part of a master plan. Then there are the fanatics. These are the people who truly believe they're invincible because God likes them more. They wade into battle, shirtless, shoeless, and sometimes swordless, just blind faith and a large stick. Their survival rate is not inspiring. A merchant has tagged along, selling relics of dubious origin. He offers you the thumb of St. Peter one day, and the official crusader toothpick the next. Both appear to be twigs. There's also a band of children. Yes, actual children. No one's quite sure where they came from or who invited them, but they've been marching for weeks and somehow have better morale than the rest of you. At night, your fellow crusaders sing songs, argue about scripture, and get into brawls over who stole whose crust of bread. One man has declared himself bishop of the tents and now gives daily sermons from atop a barrel. His theology is questionable, his balance worse. The only thing that unites this group is mutual suffering and a vague, increasingly confused goal of getting somewhere holy without dying. You don't know who's crazier, your enemies or the guy beside you who's fashioned a spear out of a soup ladle. But one thing's clear. You're not in good company. You're in weird company, and weird company gets lost together. At long last, you've reached your destination, or at least a city that looks like it might be important enough to storm. There are walls, tall ones, thick ones. Behind them, people who clearly don't want you there. So naturally the order is given. Lay siege. It sounds glorious in theory. In practice, it's medieval camping with weapons and way more diarrhea. Your army sets up outside the city, just out of arrow range, you hope, and settles in for what could be days, weeks, or the rest of your natural life. The plan is to wait for them out. You just forgot to bring food, sanitation, siege engines, or literally anything useful. Someone tries to build a catapult. It collapses instantly. A battering ram is fashioned from a tree for ropes and enthusiasm. It lasts 10 minutes before being set on fire by the defenders, who are clearly much better at this. You dig trenches. You build towers. You complain a lot. Then you realize the people inside the city are doing fine, waving at you from their high walls while munching olives and occasionally throwing insults and possibly waste over the side. It's raining. Everything is mud. Your socks dissolve. Your tent leaks. Your stew tastes like rope and betrayal. Gerald catches a rat and names it dinner. Gum. Morale is at an all-time low, mostly because someone tried to play the lute last night, and it sounded like a goat drowning in wine. And then there's the smell. Thousands of unwashed soldiers, rotting food, and the occasional dead horse. It's the sort of scent that could peel paint off a relic. The local priest says the odor is a test of faith. You think it's a biohazard. You finally try to storm the walls. Ladders are thrown up. Arrows come down. You climb 2 rungs, scream, fall off, and land on someone who was just about to surrender anyway. The assault fails. Everyone pretends they were just probing the defenses. Weeks pass. Supplies dwindle. Arguments increase. At one point, someone suggests eating the mascot goat. A fist fight breaks out. The goat wins. Sieges, you realize, aren't about action. They're about boredom, bad smells, and desperately trying to remember why you came here in the first place. One morning, when the sun rises slightly more dramatically than usual, you hear a sound echoing through the camp. The gates are open. Whether through starvation, sabotage, or divine scheduling, the city walls have finally been breached. You expect trumpets, glory, maybe a chorus of angels. Instead, you get absolute chaos. The charge into the city is less a noble procession and more a stampede of sweat. Half-mad lunatics with weapons and a vendetta against architecture. You rush forward, sword drawn, heart pounding, and immediately trip on rubble. Someone steps on your back. You think them out of instinct. Inside, it's smoke and screaming. No one can tell who's who. Everyone's looting, shouting, or dramatically dying in a corner. A knight gallops past, carrying a chandelier. Gerald has found a barrel of wine and is now declaring himself lord of the alleyway. You lose your footing, your helmet, and at one point your temper with the stubborn door. You were told this was a holy war. What it looks like is a holy yard sale, hosted by chaos itself. There's no clear chain of command anymore. Your noble commander is too busy posing for paintings that don't exist. The priests are yelling Deus Vult while shoving relics into their robes. One man insists he's seen the Holy Grail. It's a soup bowl with a dent in it. As the dust settles and the city is secured, which here means still smoldering and mostly robbed, you stand in the rubble wondering, was this the plan? You find a relic. You think it's a toe bone. Could be holy, could be a chicken. Either way, it's going in your bag. You also now possess a goblet, a tapestry you can't carry, and someone's extremely confused cat. But the victory feels strange. You expected to feel righteous, glorious. Instead, you mostly feel tired, sticky, and slightly guilty. You're standing in a place full of crying civilians and broken doors, trying to remember whether this was about salvation or plunder. The line has blurred. A priest pats your shoulder and says God is pleased. You nod, but you're not so sure. You came seeking heaven. You got Ash noise and Gerald throwing up on a relic. You made it. You survived marching, starvation, siege, illness, arrows, Gerald, and the occasional divine misunderstanding. You've technically won, but now you're sitting on a broken crate in a city you helped destroy, trying to remember what your life was like before you joined a holy war run by amateurs with swords and untreated fevers. You've changed, and not in the inspiring way I've seen the world and grown as a person kind of way. No, you're thinner, dirtier, and somehow both older and younger at once. You've aged 15 years in your soul, but still get yelled at like a child by someone whose only qualification is owning a fancier hat. You've developed a twitch whenever someone says the word pilgrimage. Your armor doesn't fit right anymore. Your body shaped itself around every bruise, every night spent, curled up like a wet pretzel in a leaky tent. Your sword is nicked. Your faith is complicated. You used to believe in clear lines, good and evil, saved and damned. Now you mostly believe in strong shoes and not eating anything that's still moving. Back home, they'll call you a hero. They'll ask what it was like. You'll smile and say incredible because deeply chaotic, morally confusing, and constantly damp doesn't fit well in a tavern tale. You might even polish the relics you stole, mount them on the wall, and pretend you knew what you were doing the whole time. You'll nod solemnly during sermons. You'll avoid looking goats in the eye. But deep down, you'll always carry the truth. You didn't crusade so much as survive a traveling disaster with a cross on top. Gerald will write poetry. Badly. Someone will start a cult. You'll quietly donate to the nearest monastery. And never speak of the time you mistook a bishop's hat for a stew pot. Was it worth it? History will say yes, you might say yes, but that twitch in your left eye, that still says probably not. The Holy Land is behind you, but so is most of your sanity. Long before samurai trained with katanas or gladiators fought in Roman arenas, there were two young Egyptian men circling each other in the desert sand. Their arms were raised, knees bent, feet planted. One feinted a move, the other lunged. No swords, no armor, just skill, strength, and the roar of a crowd watching under the burning sun. Welcome to ancient Egyptian wrestling, the oldest documented martial art in human history. More than 4,000 years ago, long before MMA gyms or Olympic podiums, the people of the Nile were already perfecting hand-to-hand combat. In a Middle Kingdom tomb at Beni Hassan, archaeologists discovered wall paintings that showed over 400 different wrestling holds, locks and throws, a manual etched in limestone. This wasn't crude brawling. It was a sophisticated system of physical control and psychological dominance. Wrestling in Egypt wasn't just sport, it was status. Boys were trained from a young age, and matches were common in both military training and festive public events. Soldiers grappled to stay sharp. Nobles competed to show their might. Even pharaohs were rumored to wrestle, not out of necessity, but as a demonstration of divine vitality. The techniques themselves are shockingly familiar. Shoulder throws, hip tosses, single-leg takedowns. Anyone who's watched modern wrestling or judo would recognize the motions. This wasn't a forgotten pastime. It was a polished tradition, one that laid the foundation for martial arts to come. And unlike later combat systems that blended weapons and philosophy, Egyptian wrestling was pure, just the human body honed to dominate another. But it had a spiritual side too. Ancient texts and temple carvings suggest that wrestling was tied to the gods, particularly Horus, who fought the gods set in a cosmic struggle. Every wrestling match was a microcosm of that myth. Order versus chaos, discipline versus wildness. In a way, these matches weren't just physical contests. They were rituals, brutal, elegant expressions of cosmic balance. And through them, Egypt became the unlikely birthplace of organized martial tradition. Long before monks meditated or warriors chanted battle cries, Egyptians simply fought in silence, in sand, in honor. And the world would never be the same again. If Egyptian wrestlers fought for honor, Roman gladiators fought for survival. Their arena was not a sandy courtyard, but a stone colosseum echoing with the cries of tens of thousands. And behind every victorious gladiator stood something even more brutal. The Ludus, Rome's gladiator training school, where martial arts met military engineering. To the Roman mind, violence was not just entertainment. It was art, politics, and power rolled into one. Gladiators were not simple brutes. They were conditioned, categorized, and crafted like weapons, each trained in a distinct fighting style with a specific set of techniques based on their gear and role in combat. The retiarius fought with a net and trident, using speed and entanglement. The secutor carried a short sword and heavy shield bred to chase and crush. Every move was calculated, every weakness known. At the core of this system were the Lannister, ruthless combat instructors who ran the Ludi like modern fight camps, only harsher. Gladiators, many of them slaves or prisoners of war, endured punishing routines, strength drills, sparring matches, mock battles with wooden weapons. Their bodies were molded into weapons of war, not for the battlefield, but for the blood-soaked sand of the Colosseum. And make no mistake, this was martial arts. The gladius, from which the term gladiator comes, was a short, thrusting sword, perfected through centuries of Roman military evolution. Gladiators were taught precise angles of attack, footwork, distance control. They learned how to read an opponent's breath, how to feint, how to strike when the crowd least expected it. The goal wasn't just to kill. It was to entertain. But it wasn't all cruelty. Some gladiators became legends, like Spartacus, a former soldier turned rebel leader who escaped the Ludus at Capua and nearly toppled the Roman Republic. Others earned their freedom through victory and became celebrities of their day, idolized like athletes, envied for their skill. Roman martial training was ruthless but systematic. It stripped men of everything, then rebuilt them as fighters whose very survival depended on their discipline, technique, and endurance. It wasn't a sport, it was a spectacle. And every arena was a battlefield where ancient martial tradition was written in sweat, sand, and blood. Long before Kung Fu dazzled the world or Judo became an Olympic sport, a hidden martial tradition thrived in the lush southern lands of India. Its name was Kalaripayattu, and it wasn't just a martial art. It was a sacred practice, a warrior's yoga, and a form of living theater passed down through millennia. Kalaripayattu, often called the mother of all martial arts, traces its roots back over 3,000 years. with legends linking it to the mythical sage Pershurama, a warrior St. said to have carved Kerala from the sea. But myth aside, it's one of the oldest surviving combat systems and arguably one of the most elegant. Where Roman training emphasized brute force, Kalaurapayattu prioritized grace, flow, and spiritual alignment. Training began at the Kalari, a sunken dirt pit that served as both a dojo and a temple. Here, barefoot students learned to move like animals. The stance of the horse, the leap of the lion, the strike of the snake. Every motion was connected to breath, energy, and rhythm before they touched a weapon. Students spent years mastering body control, kicks, and palm strikes. Then came the weapons, and with them a terrifying beauty. The Urumi, a flexible whip sword that coils around the body, is perhaps the most feared and exotic weapon in Kalaurapayattu. It's also the most poetic. One wrong move and the wielder could maim themselves. To master it required absolute focus, trust in the breath, and years of disciplined training. But what made Kalaurapayattu unique wasn't just its arsenal. It was its philosophy. Fighters were trained in Ayurveda, a traditional system of medicine, to heal what they hurt. They studied Mamam, pressure points said to control life energy. The goal wasn't destruction, but balance. Even in battle, the art emphasized restraint, timing, and inner calm, traits of a warrior sage rather than a killer. By the time colonial powers arrived, Kalaurapayattu had become a symbol of native resistance. It was banned by the British for fear of uprising, forced underground for decades, but never died. Like the flexible Urumi, it coiled in silence, only to return, flowing, lethal, and eternal. Kalaurapayattu wasn't just a martial art, it was a living philosophy, a dance of death, a hymn to life. Picture this, a misty temple nestled in the mountains of Hunan, China. A bald monk stands in silent meditation, surrounded by candles. Then, with a breath, he explodes into motion, fists whipping through the air, body twisting in fluid strikes. This is Shaolin Kung Fu, where martial arts became a spiritual path and fighting became a form of prayer. The roots of Shaolin martial arts stretch back to the 5th century CE, when Indian monk Bodhidharma arrived at the Shaolin Temple. Legend says he found the monks physically weak, unable to endure long hours of meditation. So he taught them a series of exercises, part Qigong, part self-defense, that evolved into the foundation of Shaolin Kung Fu. But this wasn't just about building muscles at Shaolin. Every movement had a purpose and a philosophy. The body and mind were one. A punch wasn't just a strike, but expression of inner clarity. A block wasn't resistance, but redirection. Zen Buddhism encouraged non-attachment, even in combat. To fight with anger was to lose. True mastery meant conquering the self. Training was brutal. Monks practiced stances until their legs trembled, struck trees to condition their limbs, and balanced on poles to improve focus. They learned to mimic the movements of animals: tiger, crane, snake, leopard, and dragon. Each style had its rhythm, strategy, and symbolism. The tiger crushed, the crane evaded, the snake flowed, the dragon transformed. Weapons training was equally rigorous. Staff, swords, spears, chains. One of the most iconic was the gun staff, known as the grandfather of all weapons. Monks were taught to turn even farming tools into instruments of defense. Why? Because Shaolin Kung Fu wasn't created for conquest. It was for protection of the temple, the people, and the spirit. Over time, Shaolin monks became legendary. They fought off bandits, resisted invading armies, and inspired rebel movements. Their martial prowess was so feared that emperors alternately patronized and persecuted them. In the Ming and Qing dynasties, Shaolin warriors were both revered and hunted. Despite temple burnings and political crackdowns, the Shaolin spirit never died. It transcended borders, influencing Japanese karate, Korean taekwondo, and global pop culture. From Bruce Lee to Hollywood, its echo still rings. Shaolin Kung Fu was more than a martial art. It was enlightenment in motion, a sacred choreography of balance, discipline, and indomitable will. In feudal Japan, martial arts were more than just combat. They were a code of life etched into the soul of the warrior class known as the samurai. At the heart of their world stood Bushido, the way of the warrior. It wasn't a martial art in itself, but a philosophical backbone that guided every strike, every step, every death. Samurai were not merely soldiers. They were living symbols of discipline, loyalty, and precision. Their martial training began young, sometimes as early as age 5. At the core of their practice was kinjutsu, the art of the sword. The katana wasn't just a weapon. It was considered the soul of the samurai, sharp, balanced, lethal, and beautiful. Every draw, swing, and sheathing of the blade followed a ritualized rhythm. Training was both physical and spiritual. Beyond kinjutsu, samurai studied jujitsu, grappling techniques used when disarmed, and kyujitsu, the art of archery. The samurai was expected to master multiple disciplines, not just for combat, but for personal growth. They meditated to cultivate zanshin, a state of total awareness in a duel. Hesitation meant death. Calmness under pressure was a matter of survival. Yet perhaps the most fascinating aspect of samurai martial tradition was its psychological depth. Bushido demanded honor, even in defeat. A warrior was taught to embrace death as part of life, to never fear it, only to meet it with grace. If dishonored, a samurai might commit seppuku ritual suicide to reclaim dignity. Harsh, yes, but in their world, integrity outweighed breath. Samurai martial arts evolved over centuries, often shaped by necessity. During long periods of peace, especially in the Tokugawa era, martial prowess took a more philosophical turn. Schools of swordsmanship emphasized mental clarity, posture, and presence over brute strength. The greatest masters like Miyamoto Musashi wrote treatises blending combat technique with Zen thought. His Book of Five Rings remains a cornerstone of martial philosophy to this day. In time, the age of the samurai faded, but their martial traditions lived on, morphing into modern kendo, aikido, and even influencing business ethics in Japan. Today, the samurai spirit survives not just in dojos, but in literature, film, and the quiet discipline of those who still walk the warrior's path. For the samurai, martial arts were not about victory. They were about becoming worthy of the sword you carried. When people think of martial arts, they often jump straight to Asia or Rome. But across the vast and diverse African continent, ancient warrior traditions flourished, fierce, complex, and largely overlooked by mainstream history. From stick fighting in Ethiopia to the Nguni spear dances of southern Africa, these were combat arts born not from textbooks, but from lived experience, survival, and deep cultural roots. In Ethiopia, Mursi and Suri tribes practiced donga, or stick fighting, a brutal but highly ritualized form of dueling. Warriors wielded long polished sticks in high-stakes bouts that could end in bloodied faces or shattered bones. But these weren't mindless brawls. Donga duels were a rite of passage, a test of manhood, strength, and even courtship. Winning meant status, respect, and sometimes the attention of potential wives. Further east in the Zulu lands, martial prowess was elevated to a national ethos. Under Shaka Zulu in the early 19th century, traditional stick fighting, called Nduku, evolved into full-fledged battlefield tactics. Shaka revolutionized African warfare by replacing throwing spears with short stabbing spears, training warriors in close combat formations. His MP regiments practiced disciplined charges, feints, and encirclement maneuvers. Their footwork, shield work, and group coordination rivaled anything seen in Roman legions. But these African martial traditions weren't just about fighting. They were deeply embedded in culture in Angola. Golo was a fluid, acrobatic martial art rooted in dance and ritual. With spinning kicks and evasive movements, it resembled a graceful battle, and it didn't stay in Angola. Enslaved Africans carried Golo across the Atlantic, where it evolved into capoeira in Brazil, one of the world's most unique martial arts. Throughout Africa, warriors also used rhythm, music, and performance in their training. War dances served dual purposes: to intimidate enemies and to psych up the body. Movements mimicked animals, spirits, or ancestors. Combat wasn't just a physical act, it was a connection to heritage, identity, and the divine. Though many of these traditions were suppressed during colonial rule, they never disappeared. Today, across African villages and modern gyms alike, these arts are making a quiet comeback, not just as fighting systems, but as cultural treasures. African martial arts remind us that the warrior's path is not defined by fame, but by resilience, community, and memory. When you think of Vikings, you might picture horned helmets, historically inaccurate, wild beards, and blood-soaked raids. But behind the Hollywood chaos was a cold, calculated system of martial training rooted in survival, discipline, and brutal efficiency. The Norse weren't just raiders. They were trained warriors with a deep respect for combat and a mythology that made dying with a sword in hand the highest honor. Viking martial arts didn't take place in Polish dojos or elegant temples. Training happened in longhouses, clearings, and on frozen battlefields. Young Norse boys were raised with one purpose: to become strong enough to defend their clan, conquer new lands, and earn a name worthy of the sagas. Combat training started early, using wooden weapons for drills and eventually progressing to steel. The sword, axe, and spear were the primary tools of Viking warfare. While their short swords were useful for close combat, it was the bearded axe, versatile, heavy, and terrifying, that became their trademark. Vikings learned how to hook shields, disarm opponents, and land killing blows with ruthless precision. There was no style. For style's sake, every move had one purpose: in the fight. But make no mistake, Viking combat wasn't mindless brawling. It was strategic, often involving tight shield walls, coordinated attacks, and feints designed to confuse the enemy. They also used holmganga, a formalized duel that settled disputes with honor. These one-on-one battles weren't just about strength. They tested composure, nerve, and technique. Beyond the physical, Viking martial discipline was deeply intertwined with mythology. Warriors believed that Odin, the god of war and wisdom, watched their battles. The berserkers, infamous for fighting in trance-like fury, were said to channel animal spirits, bear, wolf, or boar, through ritual and intoxication. Whether real or myth, the berserker legend reveals the spiritual edge of Viking warfare. And then there was Valhalla, the promised afterlife for those who died bravely in battle. This belief didn't just glorify war, it shaped how Norse warriors fought. Fearless, relentless, focused. To retreat was to forfeit paradise. To stand your ground meant eternal glory. Though Viking martial systems lacked formal documentation, their methods echo in modern reenactment groups and historical combat schools. The Vikings weren't barbarians. They were craftsmen of chaos, forging victory with steel, sweat, and an unshakable belief in their gods. In the heart of ancient Persia, beneath the domed roofs of Zircane, the House of Strength, warriors didn't just train to fight, they trained to become righteous men. Here, martial arts met music, spirituality, and national identity in one of the oldest continuously practiced warrior traditions in the world. Vasesh-e Pahlavi. This Persian martial art has roots stretching back over 2,000 years to the Achaemenid and Sassanid empires. At its core is Pahlavi, a system that combines strength training, wrestling, and combat drills with religious and ethical instruction. The word Pahlavi means not just champion, but a noble warrior, one who defends the weak and upholds justice. Training took place in the Zircana, a sacred gym where rituals mattered as much as reps. Practitioners, barefoot and bare-chested, performed choreographed movements to the rhythmic beat of a drum and the chant of the Morsht, a spiritual singer-coach. Exercises included spinning clubs, meals, lifting heavy shields, and swinging iron bows, all designed to build explosive power and flexibility. Think of it as ancient CrossFit infused with poetry and prayer. But the true heart of the system was Kashti Pahlavi, Persian wrestling. Unlike modern Olympic-style wrestling, this was both a sport and a rite of passage. Matches were intense and technical, with an emphasis on throws, leverage, and spiritual humility. Winning wasn't enough. A true Pahlavi had to be generous in victory, respectful in defeat. Philosophically, Pahlavi borrowed heavily from Sufism and Zoroastrianism. Fighters were taught to purify not just the body, but the soul. Strength without humility was weakness. Victory without compassion was disgraceful. In this sense, the Zircane was more than a gym. It was a moral forge. During periods of foreign occupation, especially under Arab and Mongol rule, the Zircane became a covert center of resistance. Persian identity and pride were preserved in sweat and song, and martial practice became a symbol of cultural defiance. Today, Vasesh-e Pahlavi still survives, officially recognized by UNESCO as a piece of intangible cultural heritage. Modern practitioners may wear track pants instead of loincloths, but the spirit remains. In Persia, The strongest warrior wasn't the one who struck the hardest. It was the one who trained hardest, lived nobly, and lifted others with every step. From the dusty tombs of Egypt to the mountainous temples of Shaolin, from the icy fjords of Scandinavia to the sun-baked zircons of Iran, ancient martial arts were never just about war. They were blueprints for how to live, how to die, and how to carry oneself with purpose. And even though empires have crumbled and swords have rusted, their echoes still resonate in the modern world, often in ways we barely notice. Walk into a mixed martial arts gym today, and you'll see the DNA of these traditions in every corner. Wrestlers shoot for takedowns like their Egyptian ancestors. Striking coaches teach spinning kicks reminiscent of Kalarapayattu. Fighters train with the same intensity that once forged gladiators and samurai. The packaging may be new, but the principles, discipline, timing, balance are as old as civilization itself. Beyond the ring, martial arts have become a global language. In schools and temples from Tokyo to New York, millions practice karate, taekwondo, kung fu, and capoeira, not just for combat, but for confidence, clarity, and community. What began as warrior rites has evolved into forms of therapy, meditation, and even cultural diplomacy. Many ancient traditions have also undergone revival. Indigenous African combat arts like Ngolo and Donga are being preserved by historians and practitioners determined to reclaim their cultural roots. In India, Kalarapayattu is enjoying a renaissance, with practitioners blending ancient movements with modern fitness. Shaolin monks now tour the world, performing feats that once guarded monasteries from invaders. But perhaps the most profound legacy of ancient martial arts is their philosophy. The idea that strength must be matched by humility, that victory is meaningless without virtue, that the true enemy is often within. In a world increasingly obsessed with speed, spectacle, and instant gratification, these age-old systems remind us to slow down, breathe, and train with intent. Technology may have changed how we fight, drones, guns, machines, but it hasn't changed why we train. The desire to master the body, still the mind, and walk the path of the warrior remains universal. So whether you're sparring in a gym, shadow boxing in your living room, or simply navigating life's daily battles, know this. You are part of a tradition older than kings, deeper than empires, and stronger than steel. The art lives on, because the warrior never truly dies. In ancient Egypt, beauty wasn't vanity, it was virtue. The Egyptians believed that outward appearance reflected inner harmony, and to be beautiful was to align yourself with Mawat, the divine order of the cosmos. Cleanliness, scent, and adornment weren't optional. They were spiritual obligations. Each morning, both men and women engaged in detailed rituals of grooming and beautification. The desert sun was relentless, and the Nile's humidity unforgiving. So the Egyptians used unguents, creamy mixtures of animal fats, beeswax, and oils, not just to moisturize their skin, but to protect against harsh weather and disease. These balms were often scented with myrrh, frankincense, or lotus, fragrances thought to be pleasing to the gods. Perfume wasn't just for the living, it was applied to the dead to sweeten the journey to the afterlife. But no beauty regimen was complete without kohl. This iconic black eyeliner was made from galena, a lead-based mineral ground into fine powder and mixed with oils or animal fats. It wasn't just for allure. Kohl protected the eyes from sun glare and was believed to ward off evil spirits. Its application created the almond-shaped, mesmerizing gaze seen in countless temple carvings and royal portraits, from Cleopatra to the boy king Tutankhamun. Cosmetics carried spiritual weight. Colors held symbolic meaning. Green eyeshadow made from malachite symbolized rebirth and was associated with the god Horus. Red ochre was used on lips and cheeks to channel vitality, joy in the goddess Hathor, patron of beauty and love. Even wigs were a statement, not just fashionable, but hygienic, allowing the head to stay shaved and cool beneath elaborate headdresses of human hair, beads, and gold wire. Beauty was also status. The wealthier the individual, the more elaborate the makeup box. Elite women had cosmetic jars of alabaster or faience, while commoners made do with pottery. Scented cones of wax were worn on wigs during banquets, slowly melting and releasing fragrance throughout the evening. A sensual fusion of hygiene, seduction, and opulence. To the Egyptians, beauty was eternal. You didn't just prepare your face for the living world, you adorned yourself for the afterlife. Because in Egypt, even the dead were expected to look divine. In ancient Greece, beauty was philosophy. Literally, the Greeks believed that physical appearance reflected moral character, and to be beautiful was to be chelos kagathos. Noble and good sculptors carved gods with idealized proportions, not to flatter the gods, but to show mortals what perfection looked like. That same obsession with harmony and balance seeped into cosmetics and grooming. For Greek women, the ideal was fair skin, a sign of purity, status, and freedom from outdoor labor. Pale complexions meant you were wealthy enough to stay indoors. To achieve this, women applied white lead, a dangerous choice by modern standards, or a natural clay called Simithian to lighten the skin. Some even used chalk or crushed pearls. It wasn't about vanity. It was about showing the world that you belonged to the elite class. Cheeks and lips were tinted with natural pigments, often made from red ochre, crushed berries, or the roots of the madder plant. Rouge gave the impression of vitality, and youth and lip stains, though subtle, hinted at sensuality without straying from social decorum. Greek beauty avoided extremes. The little color was elegant. Too much was scandalous. Eyes were defined with soot or charcoal. While not as dramatic as Egyptian kohl, this subtle lining enhanced the shape of the eyes and created a soft, shadowed look. Eyebrows were ideally joined. The famous unibrow, which was considered a mark of intelligence and purity. Women even darkened the space between brows with powders or painted it in with kohl. Hair care, too, was critical. Women lightened their hair with vinegar and sunlight, or used saffron to bring out golden hues, as blonde hair was associated with gods and heroes. Styles ranged from intricate braids to tightly wound buns, often decorated with ribbons, pins, or golden wreaths. Men, meanwhile, preferred well-groomed beards and curls, a balance between ruggedness and refinement. Greek beauty wasn't about decadence. It was about restraint, balance, and projecting inner virtue. Cosmetic use was discreet and purposeful, meant to enhance what nature gave you without appearing artificial. In public, a woman's modesty was paramount, but in private settings, especially during symposia and festivals, beauty could become a quiet form of seduction in ancient Greece. To be beautiful wasn't to stand out. It was to embody the harmony of the gods. In ancient Rome, beauty was both a weapon and a performance. Unlike the restrained elegance of the Greeks, the Romans embraced cosmetics with boldness and flair. From emperors' wives to courtesans and slaves aspiring to rise through their looks, appearance was power, and everyone knew it. A flawless complexion was the Roman gold standard. Pale skin again signified status. It meant you didn't work outside. To achieve it, Roman women used a variety of whitening agents: white lead, chalk, and even crocodile dung mixed with vinegar. Some added powdered horn or oyster shells for an extra glow. Face masks made from honey, barley, or milk were popular among the wealthy, and beauty recipes circulated among the elite like prized secrets. Rouge and lip color were in high demand. Red ochre, cinnabar, and mulberry juice were used to stain cheeks and lips, often applied in layers for a vibrant look. Unlike in Greece, Roman women weren't afraid of color, though the line between tasteful and vulgar was a constant topic in literature and gossip. A well-painted face could signal wealth, desirability, or infamy, depending on who was watching. Makeup was dramatic. Roman women darkened their lashes and lids with soot, antimony, or even charred rose petals. Eyeliner created almond-shaped eyes reminiscent of Egyptian fashion, and eyeshadow came in greens, blues, and browns. Eyebrows were carefully shaped, often darkened with burnt cork or ash. Plucking was standard. A Roman woman's mirror often included tweezers. Perfume, however, was the true Roman obsession. The wealthy layered scents, rose, cinnamon, myrrh, spikenard, in every room, every garment, and every lock of hair. Ointments were stored in alabaster and glass jars, imported from Egypt, Syria, and Arabia. A woman's scent became her signature. Even men indulged, perfuming their togas and slaves. Though moralists like Seneca often scolded this fragrant excess, wigs and hairpieces were a booming industry. Blonde wigs, especially ones made from Germanic slave hair, were fashionable among Roman elites. Hair was piled high in complex coils and waves, held in place with pins of ivory, silver, or even gold. Hairdressers or mattresses were essential household staff for the wealthy in Rome. Cosmetics weren't just about beauty. They were about status, ambition, and social theater. Every pigment, every scent, every braid told the world exactly who you were or who you wanted to be. In the bustling cities of ancient Mesopotamia, Babylon, Ur, Nineveh, beauty was inseparable from magic, medicine, and the divine. Here, where some of the world's earliest civilizations blossomed, cosmetics weren't just tools for seduction or status. They were amulets against misfortune, expressions of piety, and even ingredients in rituals of transformation. Mesopotamian women and men placed enormous importance on grooming. Scented oils and balms were central to daily life. These weren't just moisturizers in a dry climate. They were believed to carry divine energy. Applying fragrant oils was considered both hygienic and holy, aligning the body with the gods. Oils were extracted from sesame, almonds, and olives, often infused with myrrh, cedar wood, or frankincense. Eyes were the focal point of Mesopotamian beauty. Much like in Egypt, dark kohl was applied to the lids and lashes, not only for aesthetic effect but as a shield against evil spirits and diseased charcoal. Lead and crushed minerals were common ingredients mixed into pastes that were stored in small stone jars. The exaggerated eye shapes you see in Mesopotamian statues weren't artistic quirks. They reflected real cosmetic practices. Face creams and skin treatments were recorded on clay tablets. Recipes included crushed date stones, beeswax, and milk to soften and lighten the skin. Clay masks were used to treat blemishes, and scrubs made from salt or ash exfoliated the skin. Grooming manuals weren't uncommon among the elite, early examples of beauty advice that blur the line between science and sorcery. Hair was styled with care and complexity. Mesopotamian women oiled their hair to keep it shiny and manageable, braiding it into elaborate patterns or twisting it into buns, often adorned with ribbons, beads, or bronze pins. Wigs were less common than in Egypt, but hairpieces and false braids were used to add volume or display wealth. Perhaps most intriguing was the link between beauty and magic. Mesopotamian incantations often reference beautification. A spell might call for the application of a certain oil or pigment to attract love or favor. Cosmetic rituals were sometimes overseen by temple priests or priestesses, especially those serving Ishtar, goddess of love, beauty, and war. In ancient Mesopotamia, beauty was enchanting. Each cosmetic act was a ritual, each gaze in a mirror, a conversation with the divine. In the ancient cities of the Indus Valley, Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, Ladal, beauty left its traces not in written texts, but in terracotta artifacts, delicate tools, and the ghostly shimmer of powdered pigments. Though we have no deciphered script to explain their routines, the cosmetic culture of the Indus Valley speaks through its objects, quiet, refined, and deeply personal. Among the ruins, archaeologists have unearthed tiny mirrors made from polished bronze, delicately carved combs, and oval terracotta palettes still dusted with traces of red. These weren't just decorative items, they were the tools of daily self-care, suggesting that personal grooming was a consistent and valued part of life. One of the most telling discoveries is the widespread use of red pigment, likely derived from hematite or iron oxide. Applied to the lips, cheeks, and perhaps the forehead, this rouge was more than cosmetic. It may have signified fertility, spirituality, or marital status, much like the bindi in later Indian traditions. The color red, sacred and vital, has always played a central role in South Asian aesthetics, and its origins may stretch as far back as the Indus civilization. Bathing was a communal ritual. The Great Bath of Mohenjo-daro, with its brick-lined steps and surrounding rooms, points to a culture that valued cleanliness not just for hygiene, but for spiritual purity. Oils, perhaps scented with local herbs like sandalwood, turmeric, and vetiver, would have been applied before and after bathing to soften skin and calm the senses. Hair was carefully maintained, lightly oiled and styled into buns or braids. Figurines show women wearing elaborate hairstyles adorned with ornaments. Some scholars believe the people of the Indus Valley used natural plant dyes like indigo or henna to color hair and decorate the body, precursors to traditions still practiced across the Indian subcontinent today. Fragrance played a role too, though few written records survive. Botanical evidence suggests the use of aromatic resins and herbs. Incense burners found in homes and temples hint at the fusion of scent, sanctity, and everyday ritual. Beauty and cleanliness were not separate from spirituality. They were a part of it in the Indus Valley. Cosmetics were quiet symbols, worn not for spectacle, but for balance, identity, and perhaps even love. Their beauty was deliberate, subtle, and enduring. In ancient China, beauty was a reflection of nature, delicate, balanced, and deeply symbolic. To be beautiful was to evoke the serenity of a plum blossom, the purity of jade, or the grace of a crane in flight. Across dynasties from the Han to the Tang, Chinese cosmetics evolved into a refined and poetic ritual, an art form painted onto the human canvas. Pale skin was the cornerstone of Chinese beauty ideals. Much like in other ancient cultures, fair complexion signified wealth and refinement, proof that you did not toil under the sun. Women used rice powder to whiten their faces, often applying it in layers to achieve a smooth porcelain-like finish. Some mixed it with pearl dust or powdered lead, unaware of the long-term health risks. Blush was applied with care, not in harsh circles, but in soft shades resembling flower petals. This style, known as fei dian or flying dots, became particularly popular during the Tang dynasty. Women painted delicate red marks on their cheeks and sometimes foreheads, inspired by the colors of nature or the flush of love. Lips too were a statement. Red cinnabar pigment was used to tint them in a small heart-like shape, leaving the edges of the lips pale. This created a contrast that emphasized delicacy and restraint, a visual whisper of sensuality rather than a shout. Eyebrows were art. Styles changed with the dynasty, straight, arched, or curved like the wings of a swallow. Women shaved their natural brows and redrew them with charcoal or black ink. Manuals and scrolls from the Tang and Song dynasties describe dozens of distinct eyebrow styles, each with poetic names like willow leaf or distant mountains. Ornamental touches elevated beauty to theatrical levels. Women wore hua dian, tiny floral or jewel-like forehead decals made from gold leaf, paper, or crushed flower petals. These delicate dots symbolized youth, wealth, or seasonal celebration. Perfume and skincare also played vital roles. Scented oils infused with orchid, lotus, or musk were massaged into the skin, while herbal face masks using ginseng or green tea promised clarity and longevity. Beauty wasn't merely cosmetic. It was medicinal, philosophical, even moral. In ancient China, to be beautiful was to be in harmony with heaven and earth, a living poem composed of color, scent, and grace. In ancient Mesoamerica, among the Olmec, Maya, and Aztec civilizations, beauty was vibrant, ceremonial, and inseparable from the spiritual world. Unlike in some ancient societies where cosmetics were confined to elite women, in Mesoamerica, both men and women adorned their bodies with meaning. Appearance wasn't just about attraction. It was about identity, ritual, and cosmic connection. The Mesoamerican palette came from nature. Red was the most sacred color, symbolizing life, blood, and the sun. Women painted their lips with achiote seeds, which produced a deep crimson tint, while cheeks were colored with crushed cochineal, a brilliant red dye made from insects harvested on cactus. Black and white were used for contrast, contouring the face or framing the eyes with charcoal and powdered lime. Body painting was common and often ritualistic. Dyes and mineral pigments were applied during festivals, warfare, or religious ceremonies. Warriors painted their faces to intimidate enemies and honor the gods. Priests painted their bodies with ash or chalk to purify themselves for sacrifice or ceremony, and young women wore subtle marks on their faces during courtship rituals, hinting at readiness for marriage. Perfume and fragrance held divine significance. The Aztecs were obsessed with flowers, xochitl, which they used not only in offerings but also in personal adornment. Fragrant blooms like marigolds, plumeria, and cacao flowers were woven into garlands or crushed into pastes and rubbed onto the skin. Copal, a sacred tree resin, was burned as incense and mixed with oils to scent the body before rituals. Hairstyles were deeply symbolic. Maya women wore long, thick braids coiled atop their heads or twisted into buns, sometimes adorned with jade beads or feathers. Aztec noblewomen used hairpieces, ribbons, and even gold dust to enhance their appearance. Men, particularly warriors, styled their hair according to their rank, with shaved patterns or elaborate knots indicating valor in battle. Tattooing and scarification were also practiced, especially among the Maya. These permanent marks weren't decorative. They were spiritual badges of endurance, dedication, or religious transformation. Even dental cosmetics existed. Elites had jade or turquoise inlays placed into their teeth, signaling status and divine favor. For the Mesoamericans, beauty was sacred. Every pigment, flower, and braid was a symbol, a bridge between the earthly body and the celestial realm. In the misty forests and windswept hills of ancient Europe, the Celts cultivated a vision of beauty that was both fierce and earthy, wild. Yet intentional, they didn't follow the ornate rituals of Rome or the elegance of Egypt, but their appearance was no less important. To the Celts, grooming and adornment were signs of vitality, bravery, and tribal identity. And yes, even warriors had favorite combs. Celtic men and women alike paid attention to their looks. Bronze combs, razors, and tweezers have been found in burial sites, showing that personal grooming was valued. Hair was considered sacred, and both sexes often wore it long, wavy, and styled with lime or animal fat for volume and stiffness, giving warriors that famous spiked or swept back look that struck fear into their enemies. But perhaps the most iconic element of Celtic appearance was woad, the blue dye extracted from the Aesotis tinctoria plant. Warriors painted swirling designs across their faces and bodies, not only to intimidate foes in battle, but also for ceremonial or spiritual reasons. While some debate how widespread woad use truly was, classical writers like Julius Caesar certainly thought it terrifying enough to mention. Jewelry was essential not just for adornment, but for identity and social rank. Elaborate talks, neck rings made from twisted gold or bronze, were worn proudly by both men and women. Earrings, bracelets, and hairpins added to the visual power. These weren't just accessories, they were badges of strength, lineage, and honor. Makeup was subtler but present. Red ochre was used on cheeks and lips, particularly by women of noble status. Tattoos and body paint may have also had a role in storytelling, marking key life events, tribal affiliations, or spiritual achievements. Animal symbolism was deeply woven into Celtic belief, and it's likely that some body art reflected that connection. Mirrors, polished bronze discs with decorated backs, were found in graves of elite women, suggesting that self-presentation held both social and ritual weight. Beauty for the Celts wasn't just about seduction, it was about identity. A well-groomed warrior was seen as disciplined, a finely adorned woman as wise and powerful. In the Celtic world, beauty was raw, elemental, and filled with pride. It honored both the earth beneath their feet and the spirits they believed watched from the trees. Across ancient civilizations, beauty didn't end with life. It extended into death. From the embalmed faces of Egyptian mummies to the perfumed bodies prepared for Roman funerals, cosmetics were not merely tools of seduction or status. They were sacred offerings to the divine, marks of respect for the dead, and symbols of a person's identity carried into eternity. In ancient Egypt, this belief was especially vivid. The dead were buried with their makeup palettes, coal containers, and scented oils, often placed carefully within the tomb beside shabby figurines and amulets. Why? Because looking presentable in the afterlife mattered. You were expected to meet the gods looking divine. Tomb paintings show the deceased wearing full makeup, rouged cheeks, elaborate wigs, eyes lined in perfect black. Beauty was eternal, and cosmetics were as essential as food and water for the journey to the next world. The Romans, too, took grooming seriously in death. Elite Romans prepared their bodies with myrrh, cinnamon, and spikenard. Perfumed oils preserved the flesh and masked the smell of decay, but more than that, they elevated the body to a god-like state. Roman funerals were public displays of wealth and virtue, and a well-groomed corpse reflected honor on the entire family. Among the Greeks, funerary rites included washing the body, dressing it in fine robes, and adorning it with oils and garlands. Mirrors, combs, and cosmetic tools were buried with women, especially among the aristocracy. This wasn't vanity, it was remembrance. These objects told a story about who the deceased had been, refined, admired, connected to the divine order of beauty. In Mesopotamia, Oils and incense were used to anoint the dead as part of sacred ritual. Cosmetic substances were believed to have protective properties, warding off demons and ensuring a peaceful passage to the underworld. Death was not an erasure of beauty, but a transformation of it into something cosmic and enduring. Even in prehistoric burials, red ochre has been found sprinkled over bodies, possibly symbolic of blood, rebirth, or vitality. It suggests that the impulse to beautify and sanctify the body in death is as old as civilization itself. Across cultures and centuries, cosmetics bridged the mortal and the divine. In life, they dazzled. In death, they were consecrated. Beauty wasn't fleeting. It was forever. Beneath the chaotic rhythm of Istanbul, the calls to prayer, the fairy horns on the Bosphorus, the footsteps of tourists rushing between mosques and markets, there is silence, cool, echoing, ancient silence. You step down a stone staircase, and the temperature shifts. The air becomes damp. Then, suddenly, the city vanishes, and the Basilica Cistern swallows you whole. Built in the 6th century under Emperor Justinian the Great, the Basilica Cistern, known in Turkish as Yerebedin Sarnik, is the largest surviving underground water reservoir from the Byzantine Empire. It's a hidden cathedral of water, vast, brooding, and quiet as a tomb. Over 300 feet long and 200 feet wide, it once held up to 80,000 cubic meters of water, enough to supply the Great Palace of Constantinople and surrounding buildings. But this wasn't just a utilitarian tank. No, the Byzantines even built their water storage with ambition. The cistern is supported by 336 marble columns, most towering over 9 meters tall, arranged in 12 perfect rows. The ceilings they hold curve gently into vaults, creating the illusion of a cathedral submerged in shadow. Reflections ripple beneath your feet. It feels as if you've stepped into the underworld, lit only by the glint of water and the occasional flickering spotlight. The source of this water, the distant Belgrade Forest, was brought through aqueducts stretching for miles. Water in Constantinople was survival. The city had been besieged more times than anyone could count, and in times of war, when aqueducts were cut and fountains ran dry, the Basilica Cistern ensured life continued underground. For centuries, it was forgotten. After the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in 1453, the cistern slipped from public memory, its entrances sealed, its purpose lost. Locals spoke of houses with mysteriously wet basements, some even fished from their floors. It wasn't until the 16th century that a curious scholar rediscovered it. Guided by tales of water that whispered beneath the earth, today it stands not just as a monument to Byzantine ingenuity, but as a surreal echo of a world that once ruled the known earth, a place where time seems to drip slowly from the ceiling, and the ghosts of emperors walk silently between the columns. To understand the Basilica Cistern, you have to understand its creator, Emperor Justinian the Great. Ruler of the Eastern Roman Empire in the 6th century, Justinian wasn't content with merely preserving Rome's legacy. He wanted to outshine it. He built cathedrals, courts, walls, and aqueducts, a stone and mortar declaration that Constantinople was a new Rome. And beneath the city's foundation, he built a marvel no one would see, the Basilica Cistern. Construction began around 532 CE, shortly after the Nika riots burned half the city to the ground. In the smoldering aftermath, Justinian commissioned a new underground water reservoir that would not only supply his rebuilt imperial palace, but also withstand siege and fire. It was both a precaution and a political statement. Constantinople would never thirst, and the emperor would never falter. The cistern was built on the site of a former basilica, hence the name, and would require enormous resources. Thousands of laborers, including prisoners of war, carved out a space nearly the size of a cathedral beneath the city. The result was an underground reservoir measuring 138 by 64 meters, supported by 336 columns, many of them reused or spolia, taken from older Roman and Greek temples. Reusing columns wasn't just economical, it was symbolic. Justinian was literally building a new empire on the ruins of the old Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian capitals sitting side by side, reminders that Rome's grandeur had been inherited, reshaped, and submerged beneath Constantinople. The engineering was astonishing. Vaulted ceilings distributed weight evenly. Brick walls were waterproofed with thick layers of mortar. Arch supports prevented collapse, and most importantly, the cistern was fed by the Varlins and Hadrian aqueducts, some stretching over 19 kilometers from the Belgrade forest. This ensured the cistern could store vast reserves ready for drought, fire, or siege. But the true brilliance of the cistern is its invisibility. It did not boast. It hid. The public never saw it. There were no triumphal arches or gilded mosaics, just quiet, dark utility. A subterranean heartbeat beneath the city's grandeur. And yet, for all its silence, it was a lifeline, an emperor's answer to chaos and collapse. It whispered one message through every brick that Rome still lived, just deeper underground. Step inside the basilica cistern, and you don't feel like you've entered a reservoir. You feel like you've stumbled into a forgotten temple. A forest of stone rises around you. 336 marble columns arranged in perfect rows, their reflections shimmering across black water. The silence is only broken by the occasional drip from the ceiling, echoing like the breath of the past. These columns aren't uniform. That's part of what makes them so haunting. Some are smooth, others fluted. Their capitals range from Ionic scrolls to Corinthian leaves, and a few seem entirely improvised. That's because many of these columns were spolia, architectural or sculptural pieces recycled from earlier Roman and Greek ruins. It's a mosaic of empires within one structure, as if the gods of old temples had been exiled to this damp underworld. Most columns stand around 9 meters tall, supporting brick arches that make the entire chamber feel like a submerged cathedral. The marble, soaked in centuries of moisture, glows faintly under the cistern's dim lighting. Yellow, gray, and pink tones flickering across the stone like candlelight trapped in water. Among these pillars, two stand out for their eerie artistry, the Tyr column and the Medusa columns. The Tyr column, also called the Weeping Column, is covered in swirling engravings resembling peacock eyes or teardrops. Some believe it was carved to honor the slaves who died during the cistern's construction. Legend says that if the column drips on you, it brings good luck, a somber myth for a place already heavy with memory. The placement of the columns, 12 rows of 28, wasn't random. Their arrangement created symmetry and balance, a Byzantine obsession rooted in both Roman engineering and Christian cosmology. Even in a structure few were meant to see, aesthetic order mattered. The Byzantines understood that beauty and function were never separate. Over the centuries, algae and mineral buildup have softened the lines of the columns. Roots once crept through cracks in the ceiling, bats nested in the arches. Time, like water, wore everything smooth. Today, walking between these columns feels like drifting through a dream, as if the world above has forgotten something sacred that continues to wait in the dark in the far northwest corner of the basilica cistern, tucked beneath two marble columns, lie the most enigmatic relics of the entire structure. Two massive stone Medusa heads. One is laid sideways, the other rests upside down. No inscriptions, no explanations. Just two ancient faces staring out from under the water, as if waiting for someone to ask the right question. Where did they come from? No one knows for certain. Scholars believe the heads were likely taken from a Roman temple or public building, and reused here as column bases during construction in the 6th century. They are masterpieces of Roman stonework, detailed, expressive, and disturbingly lifelike. And yet here they sit, submerged in silence, repurposed into structural filler. It's as if the serpent-haired Gorgon had been exiled into the damp to hold up the weight of the empire she once defied. The fact that one head is sideways and the other upside down has puzzled historians for centuries. Some say it was purely practical, a way to make the blocks fit beneath the columns. But the Byzantines were too careful, too symbolic for that to be the only reason. More compelling theories suggest the positioning was intentional to neutralize Medusa's power, a way of defanging the myth, rendering her petrifying gaze harmless underground. Others whisper of deeper symbolism. Medusa was, after all, a symbol of rebellion, of the monstrous feminine, a power feared and punished. To place her beneath the feet of the empire, literally, may have been a quiet political message, a sculptural act of domination. Or perhaps the opposite, a secret rebellion carved into stone, hidden away in the underworld of Constantinople. In Greek mythology, Medusa's head was used by Perseus as a weapon, even after her death. Her image became apotropaic, meant to ward off evil. She appeared on shields, coins, and doorways. Could her presence here have been protective? Was she placed in the cistern not to punish, but to safeguard the sacred water below the city? Visitors today still pause in front of the Medusa's hushed. The air seems heavier near them, whether you believe in myths or not. Their presence is undeniable. You don't just look at Medusa and the Basilica Cistern. You feel her watching you back. In ancient Constantinople, water meant survival. The city was famed for its towering walls, its gold-covered churches, and its imperial courts. But without water, it was nothing more than a gilded coffin. The Basilica Cistern wasn't just a marvel of architecture, it was a military asset. Hidden beneath the city's foundations, it served as a silent lifeline during times of siege, drought, and disaster. The Byzantine capital was under constant threat. Surrounded by enemies for centuries, Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, Crusaders, the city endured countless sieges. One of the most devastating was the Arab siege of 717-718 CE, where food and water supplies were stretched thin for over a year. While aqueducts could be cut or poisoned, the cisterns, sealed underground and stocked in advance, ensured that Constantinople did not fall. The Basilica Cistern, with its massive capacity, helped sustain the palace and nearby districts through these long, desperate days. Its water was channeled in from the Belgrade Forest, located over 19 kilometers away. A system of elevated aqueducts, most notably the Valens Aqueduct, delivered water to the city, which was then stored in open-air cisterns and covered structures like this one. The Basilica Cistern stood out because it was both covered and underground, protected from heat, sunlight, and contamination. In an era when cities could die of thirst, that was revolutionary. But water was more than just tactical. It was symbolic. In Byzantine theology and imperial iconography, water represented life, rebirth, and divine favor. To control it, especially during a siege, was to show that God still smiled upon the city. This is why so many of Constantinople's cisterns were not only functional, but beautifully constructed. The basilica, with its forest of columns and eerie grandeur, was a quiet cathedral to resilience. Even during the Ottoman conquest in 1453, while the city above was burning and falling, the waters of the cistern below remained calm. After the conquest, it was largely forgotten, sealed off and unused. But during those final Byzantine years, it had served its purpose. Today, as tourists wander between its columns, few realize they are walking atop one of the most crucial defenses of an empire. Not a sword or a wall, but something far more precious. Silence, water, and time. For nearly a century after the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in 1453, the Basilica Cistern lay in silence. The Ottomans, brilliant engineers in their own right, built new aqueducts and fountains that served the growing city above. The ancient Byzantine waterworks, tucked underground, unmarked and dim, faded from collective memory. No one advertised the cistern. No plaques, no maps, no fanfare. Just still water beneath the stones. And yet the cistern refused to be forgotten. Locals in the neighborhood around Hagia Sophia began to report strange things. Some said their basements were damp year-round, no matter the season. Others claimed they could drop buckets through holes in their floors and pull up cold, fresh water. A few even claimed they were catching fish underground, a bizarre, quiet miracle happening right below the bustling Ottoman streets. It wasn't until the 1540s that the cistern was formally rediscovered by the curious eyes of Petrus Gillius, a French scholar and traveler. Sent to Constantinople by King Francis I to study ancient texts and monuments, Gillius had a habit of asking too many questions when he heard about the locals pulling up water and fish from the floors of their homes. He began investigating. Eventually, he found an entrance, likely through a private home, and descended into the murky depths. What he discovered astounded him, a subterranean space larger than many cathedrals in Europe, filled with columns, dark water, and dripping echoes. He rode through the cistern by candlelight, sketching and measuring its dimensions, noting the carved capitals and mysterious Medusa heads. Gillius's writings introduced the Basilica Cistern to the wider world, a lost wonder of the Byzantines, preserved beneath the Ottoman capital. Yet even after his discovery, the cistern wasn't restored or opened to the public. It remained mostly hidden, used occasionally as a water source, but left in semi-obscurity. The Ottoman Empire had its own monumental projects to focus on. This one was a relic. Beautiful, yes, but buried in the past. It would take centuries more before the cistern was drained, cleaned and opened as a historical monument. But thanks to a curious French scholar and a few rumors spreading locals, the silent cistern stirred once more, no longer forgotten, but waiting to rise from the depths. Today, when visitors descend the dim stairway near Istanbul's Hagia Sophia and step into the Basilica Cistern, they don't just encounter a historical ruin. They enter a living monument. It's a space where architecture, atmosphere, and memory blur together. Lit by amber lights and filled with the soft sound of dripping water, the cistern feels more like a sacred ritual than a tourist stop. It wasn't always this way. When Turkish authorities decided to restore and reopen the Basilica Cistern in the late 20th century, they found a flooded ruin filled with centuries of mud, algae, and decay. The columns were stained. The floor was invisible beneath water and sediment, but the bones were still solid. The structure had survived earthquakes, fires, wars, and abandonment, all while holding its ceiling high. After extensive cleaning and restoration, walkways were installed just above the water level. Lighting was carefully chosen to highlight the graceful curves of the columns and reflect them in the dark water below. The result? An atmosphere that feels more like an underground cathedral than a reservoir. It's no coincidence that some call it the Sunken Palace. And in the silence you hear it. The echo. Every footstep, every whisper, every drop of water reverberates through the stone like a chant from another world. It's haunting, beautiful, and timeless. It's no wonder that filmmakers and artists have flocked to space. The Basilica Cistern has appeared in films like From Russia with Love and Inferno, and in countless documentaries and music videos. It's not just a historical site, it's a stage. Visitors are often caught off guard by how emotional the space feels. Children lower their voices. Tourists slow their pace. Even the most distracted traveler stops to stare at the Medusa heads, half submerged and brooding in the shadows. There's something magnetic about this place. It doesn't ask for reverence. It quietly demands it. In recent years, the cistern has also hosted art installations, concerts, and exhibitions. Modern light shows play with the reflections on the water, turning the chamber into a pool of color and sound. It is paradoxically more alive now than ever, a space once hidden, now illuminated with new meaning from imperial utility to artistic sanctuary. The Basilica Cistern has risen again, not with fire or conquest, but with silence, water, and light. In a city that has seen empires rise and fall, water has remained Istanbul's oldest and quietest witness. The Basilica Cistern, more than just a storage vault, holds centuries of symbolism, not only as a resource, but as a spiritual and philosophical presence for the Byzantines and later the Ottomans. Understood that water was never just about hydration. It was about purification, power, and the thin veil between worlds. Water in the cistern moves slowly. It does not rush and it does not speak. It ripples and reflects. Light dances across its surface, breaking the symmetry of the columns. In this, there's a kind of sacred theater. The stillness forces you to look inward like a mirror. The cistern reflects not just light, but history, identity, and myth. In Byzantine theology, water played a central role in rebirth. Baptism, the most essential Christian ritual, was a watery transition from death to life, sin to purity. While the Basilica Cistern wasn't used for religious ceremonies, its aura evokes that same liminal space. You descend into the earth and encounter darkness, then light, then silence. It feels like passing through a ritual, unspoken but undeniably sacred. Some scholars argue that the location of the cistern near the Hagia Sophia and the Great Palace was no accident. It served not only as infrastructure, but as symbolic assurance. The emperor's court was not built on dry foundations, but on flowing, living water. Beneath every throne, a river. Beneath every law, reflection. The Ottomans, too, revered water. Their gardens, palaces, and mosques were designed around fountains and pools. Water represented divine mercy in Islam, Rama, and architectural water features reminded the faithful of paradise. The Basilica Cistern may have been a Byzantine creation, but it fit quietly into Ottoman cosmology, cool, hidden, and eternally flowing. And then there's the psychological symbolism. Walking through the cistern evokes more than awe. It whispers memory, the way light filters through columns, the hush of footsteps echoing across water, the slow drip from a ceiling that seems to breathe. It is a space that doesn't rush to reveal itself. It waits like water, like history. Today, the Basilica Cistern is no longer hidden. It stands proudly among Istanbul's top destinations, a haunting yet majestic reminder that the city's true heart beats not just in its minarets and mosques, but deep beneath the ground. Millions descend its steps every year, not just to learn about ancient hydraulics, but to feel the weight of time pressing gently from the walls. In a city bursting with noise and movement, the Sistan is one of the few places where silence dominates. Tourists instinctively whisper. Even the click of a camera shutter seems too loud. And yet, there's life here, not just in the steady flow of visitors, but in the subtle shifts of light, the quiet splashes, and the performances that occasionally bring the space roaring back to life. Over the last 2 decades, the system has hosted art exhibits, laser shows, classical music concerts, and sound installations that merge past and present. Artists and architects treat it as a canvas, a sacred space where history is not locked in glass, but is part of the atmosphere. You don't observe the Basilica Cistern from a distance. You walk through it, you breathe it in. Restoration efforts have been delicate but vital. The columns have been cleaned, structural supports reinforced, and walkways improved to allow better access. At the same time, care has been taken not to strip away the very things that make it otherworldly: the soft lighting, the cool air, the low hum of dripping water. It remains an engineering marvel, yes, but also a reminder that infrastructure can be beautiful, even mystical. While the modern world debates utility versus aesthetics, the Byzantines created a water tank as elegant as a cathedral. That contradiction still stuns visitors today. Above ground, Istanbul pulses with new energy. Modern trams glide past ancient sites. In St. vendors sell roasted chestnuts beside Roman ruins. Yet directly below it all lies the Basilica Cistern, unmoved, unbothered, eternal. It holds the stories of emperors, architects, invaders, and dreamers, all now echoes in the damp stone. In the Basilica Cistern, time doesn't feel linear. It loops like water circling in a basin. Past and present meet in silence, and for a moment. You're not just in Istanbul, you're in Byzantium, in Constantinople, in a shadow world that never really left.